Hi guys, and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we wander into a place where the horizon looks endless. The wind rarely rests, and the earth beneath your boots has begun to behave in a way that no farmer ever truly expects. You are standing somewhere on the Great Plains of the United States in the early 1930s. The air smells faintly of dry grass and warm soil. The sky stretches above you in a wide pale blue dome that feels almost too big, as if the world forgot to place walls around it. At first glance, the land looks peaceful. A farmhouse sits quietly beside a dirt road. A windmill turns slowly in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor coughs and rattles across a field that was supposed to be green with wheat by now. But it is not green, it is brown. And not the healthy brown of freshly turned soil either. This is the dusty, powdery brown of earth that has forgotten how to hold itself together. You feel the wind brush against your face. It is not strong yet, just enough to carry a faint ribbon of dust along the road. It skims across the ground like a whisper. Farmers out here have seen wind all their lives. The Great Plains are famous for it. Still, something about this wind feels different. You crouch down and scoop a handful of soil from the ground. Instead of forming a solid clump, the dirt falls through your fingers like flour. That tiny detail tells you almost everything. Across much of the central United States during the early 1930s, a devastating drought began tightening its grip on the land. Rainfall dropped sharply across states like Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Colorado. Fields that had once produced enormous harvests of wheat slowly dried out. Without moisture, the soil lost its strength. According to agricultural records, from the time millions of acres of farmland became dangerously exposed to wind erosion. Of course, standing here now, no one is talking about wind erosion. That sounds like something from a modern environmental textbook. Instead, people just say the land is tired, or that the sky has forgotten how to rain. You start walking toward the farmhouse. The building is simple, wooden boards faded pale by years of sun. A small porch with a rocking chair that creaks gently whenever the breeze passes by. On the porch sits a pair of muddy boots that probably belong to the farmer who lives here. The door opens and a man steps outside. His hat is pulled low against the light. He squints toward the horizon, studying the sky the way farmers have done for thousands of years. Weather watching is practically a survival skill out here. He does not greet the sky with optimism. He studies it like an opponent. Out on the plains, rain is everything. Without it, wheat cannot grow. Without wheat, the farm cannot survive. And if the farm fails, the family that depends on it has very few options. You follow the farmer's gaze out toward the fields. From the porch, the land stretches in long, rolling waves of pale dirt. Rows that should be filled with wheat shoots are mostly empty. Here and there you see weak little plants struggling upward, but they look thin and uncertain. The farmer walks down the porch steps and kicks at the soil with his boot. A small cloud of dust jumps into the air. That sight alone is enough to make his shoulders slump slightly. For decades before this moment, farmers across the plains had been encouraged to plough more land than ever before. Wheat prices had soared during World War I, and many people rushed west to claim farmland. Huge areas of native prairie grass were ploughed under to create new crop fields. Those deep-rooted grasses had once anchored the soil firmly in place. Now they are gone. In their place lies loose dirt that the wind can easily grab. Historians often point out that the Dust Bowl was not caused by drought alone. The farming practices of the previous decades also played a role. When millions of acres of prairie were converted into farmland, the natural protection that held the soil steady disappeared. Still, people living here in the early 1930s do not think in those terms. They simply know that something is wrong with the land. The farmer walks out into the field and you follow behind him. The ground crunches softly underfoot, dry and brittle. The smell of dust grows stronger as the sun warms the earth. Somewhere far away you hear the faint rumble of thunder. The farmer pauses. For a moment, hope flickers across his face. Thunder means rain sometimes, but the sky remains mostly clear except for a distant grey smudge near the horizon. You keep watching that smudge. It grows. Slowly at first, like a stain spreading across the sky. At this point, it is still far away, but the farmer notices it too. His eyes narrow slightly. He mutters something under his breath. Around here, people have begun using a strange new phrase to describe what sometimes appears on the horizon. They call it a black blizzard. The name sounds dramatic, almost theatrical, but unfortunately, it is very real. Instead of snow, the storm carries dirt. Instead of icy wind, it brings suffocating clouds of dust that can swallow entire towns. But right now, the approaching shape is still just a distant smear in the sky. It might pass by without causing much trouble. Out on the plains, the weather can change direction quickly. You walk back toward the house with the farmer. The porch boards creak softly as you climb the steps. Inside the house, you hear quiet movement. Someone is preparing food in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifts through the open door. For a moment, life feels almost normal. A woman appears in the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth apron. She smiles politely when she notices the two of you standing there. Her expression carries the calm determination that many families on the plains have learned to wear. You step inside the farmhouse. Immediately you notice something interesting. Along the edges of the floor, tiny lines of dust have collected where the wooden boards meet the walls. It is such a small detail that most visitors might miss it, but the woman notices it instantly. Without saying a word, she reaches for a broom and sweeps the dust into a little pile. People out here sweep constantly. Dust finds its way through window cracks under doors and even through the smallest gap in the walls. Cleaning becomes a quiet daily ritual that never truly ends. Here is a quirky little detail from the time. Some families, during the Dust Bowl years, placed damp sheets over their windows and doorways in an attempt to trap blowing dust before it filled the house. It worked sometimes, though it also made the room smell faintly like wet laundry and earth. You sit at the small wooden kitchen table while the wind outside grows just a little stronger. The window glass rattles softly in its frame. The farmer glances outside again. That dark smudge on the horizon has grown larger. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough to make him watch it carefully. Researchers still debate exactly when local residents first realised that the dust storms were becoming something far more dangerous than ordinary prairie weather. At the beginning, many people assumed the storms were temporary, just another bad season. But slowly the truth began to settle in. The land itself was beginning to move, grain by grain, field by field, across the plains. And as you sit quietly in the farmhouse kitchen, listening to the wind brush against the walls, you begin to understand something unsettling. This is only the beginning of the story. The storms are still gathering on the horizon. Morning arrives slowly across the plains, and you feel it before you fully see it. The wind has softened overnight, leaving a strange quiet hanging over the land. When you step outside the farmhouse, the air carries the faint smell of dry soil and old straw. The sky glows pale and wide above you, washed with a thin layer of morning light. At first everything appears calm, but when you look closely at the field stretching beyond the house, the calm begins to feel fragile. The land does not look like farmland that is preparing for a harvest. It looks tired. You walk with the farmer out toward the fields again. The ground crunches beneath your boots. Every step releases another small puff of powdery dirt that drifts away in the breeze. The wheat crop this year is barely clinging to life. Thin green blades poke out here and there, but they look fragile, like something that might disappear if the wind simply decides to breathe a little harder. The farmer kneels and pushes his fingers into the soil. Instead of firm earth, he finds something closer to dust. This is the quiet problem shaping life across the Great Plains in the early 1930s. Without rain, the soil dries into a loose layer that cannot hold itself together. Crops struggle to grow roots deep enough to survive. Agricultural reports from the era note that by the middle of the decade, tens of millions of acres of farmland had been severely damaged by drought and wind erosion. But standing here now, statistics mean very little. What matters is that the crop in front of you probably will not survive the summer. The farmer stands slowly and wipes his hands on his trousers. His movements carry a sort of practiced patience. Farmers out here have always understood that nature does not take orders. Still, you can sense the worry behind his calm expression. Farming is not just a job here. It is the entire structure of life. The land feeds the family, pays the bills, and shapes the rhythm of every day. If the land fails, everything else begins to wobble. You walk farther into the field together. In the distance, a windmill creaks as it turns. Its metal blades catch the sunlight in brief flashes as they spin. The windmill pumps water from a well deep underground. That water is precious. It is used carefully for the livestock and sometimes for the small garden near the house. But pumping enough water to save entire wheat fields is impossible, so the farmer relies on rain. And the rain has simply stopped coming. Some meteorologists studying weather patterns later suggested that unusual shifts in ocean temperatures may have helped create the drought conditions of the early 1930s. At the time, of course, farmers had no way to track such global patterns. They simply watched the sky day after day, waiting. You follow the farmer toward a wooden fence where a few cattle stand quietly. The animals look thinner than they should for this time of year. Their ribs show slightly beneath their hides. Feeding livestock becomes another challenge when crops fail. Hay supplies shrink quickly, and purchasing feed from elsewhere costs money many families no longer have. The farmer pats one of the cows gently along its neck. Animals are not just property here. They are part of the farm's survival. Losing them would be another heavy blow. Here is a strange little tidbit from the era that people sometimes forget. During the Dust Bowl years, dust storms were so severe that cattle occasionally suffocated when thick clouds of airborne soil clogged their lungs. Farmers would sometimes find animals standing in the fields with dust packed into their nostrils like fine grey powder. You glance back toward the farmhouse. From here, it looks small against the vast landscape. The porch sits quietly beneath the wide sky, and the kitchen window glows faintly with morning light. Inside, breakfast is probably being prepared. Meals during the Great Depression are simple affairs. Families rely on whatever ingredients they can produce themselves or purchase cheaply. Flour, beans, potatoes, and preserved vegetables form the backbone of many meals. You and the farmer head back toward the house. As you approach the porch, the smell of frying bread drifts out through the open door. It is a comforting scent, warm and familiar. In difficult times, even simple food carries enormous emotional value. You step inside the kitchen again. The woman from earlier is standing by the stove flipping slices of bread in a cast iron pan. She glances toward the window every so often, as if checking whether the wind has returned. The table is already set with chipped ceramic plates and sturdy tin cups. Dust has gathered along the windowsill overnight. A thin brown line marks where the wind pushed soil through tiny cracks in the frame. The woman wipes it away with a cloth before sitting down. This kind of quiet cleaning happens constantly in Dust Bowl homes. People sweep floors multiple times a day. They wipe surfaces again and again, knowing that within hours another layer will appear. Dust becomes an invisible roommate that never leaves. You sit at the table and listen to the soft clatter of utensils and the low hum of the wind outside. The farmer eats slowly, lost in thought. Occasionally he glances out the window toward the distant fields. You notice something interesting as the conversation drifts gently between topics like whether livestock and the condition of neighbouring farms. No one here talks about giving up. Even though the land is failing, the idea of abandoning the farm still feels almost unthinkable. Generations of families have built their lives on these plains. Houses, barns, fences, wells, all of it represents years of work. Walking away from that would mean starting over from nothing. Many people continue farming year after year despite the worsening conditions. Historians still argue whether optimism or stubbornness played the larger role in keeping families on their farms during the early Dust Bowl years. Some believe farmers genuinely believed the drought would end soon. Others suggest that leaving simply felt too frightening compared to staying. After breakfast, the farmer pulls on his boots again. The day's work continues even when the harvest looks uncertain. There are fences to repair, equipment to maintain, and animals to care for. Farm life does not pause just because the weather refuses to cooperate. You follow him outside once more. The wind has returned slightly. Not strong enough to cause trouble yet, but enough to send little ribbons of dust drifting along the ground. You watch those thin streams of soil slide across the field. They move slowly, quietly, almost harmlessly. But anyone who lives on the plains long enough begins to understand something important. Those little drifting trails of dust are the first whispers of a much larger storm. And before long, the wind will decide to speak much louder. Morning settles into the farmhouse kitchen with a gentle rhythm that feels almost comforting despite everything happening outside. Sunlight slips through the dusty window glass and stretches across the wooden table where breakfast is slowly disappearing. The smell of fried bread still lingers in the air, warm and faintly buttery, mixed with the deeper aroma of strong coffee. You notice how carefully every bit of food is handled. Nothing here is wasted. The woman at the stove scrapes the last crumbs from the pan and places them into a small bowl. Even crumbs can be useful later. They might thicken a soup or stretch a meal that would otherwise feel too small. During the Great Depression, many rural families survived by learning how to make simple ingredients last as long as possible. Wheat flour, cornmeal beans, potatoes, and preserved vegetables formed the backbone of daily meals across the plains. Meat appeared less frequently than people might imagine. The farmer finishes his coffee and wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. His plate is clean except for a thin shine of grease from the bread. Outside the window, the windmill continues its slow turning, squeaking softly as the blades catch the breeze. Breakfast in this house is not loud or hurried. People speak quietly, saving their energy for the work ahead. There is something calm about the pace, even though everyone understands how uncertain the future feels. You take another look around the kitchen. The room is simple but carefully maintained. Shelves hold glass jars filled with preserved vegetables from last year's garden. Pickled beans, cucumbers, and a few jars of peaches sit in neat rows. A sack of flour rests in the corner near the stove. These supplies represent security. Many families in rural America during the early 1930s relied heavily on home preservation techniques. Canning fruits and vegetables allowed people to store food for months at a time. When crops were good, shelves could be filled with jars that would carry a family through the winter. Now those jars are being used more cautiously. Another interesting detail from the era involves something called Depression cooking. Housewives developed creative recipes designed specifically to stretch small amounts of ingredients. A popular example is something known as water pie, which sounds like a joke but was quite real. The pie filling used mostly water, sugar, flour and butter to create something that resembled custard. It was not fancy, but it helped families feel like they were still enjoying dessert. The woman begins rinsing dishes in a basin of warm water. She works with steady, practiced movements while glancing occasionally toward the window. Dust has already begun collecting again along the sill. You realise something about life here. Cleaning is not just about keeping the house tidy, it is about maintaining a sense of control in a world that has begun to feel unpredictable. Outside, the farmer gathers a few tools from the porch. The metallic clink of equipment carries faintly through the open door. Farm work after breakfast usually begins with chores around the property. Animals need feeding. Fences require checking. Equipment must be maintained even if the fields themselves are struggling. You step outside and feel the wind brushing lightly against your face again. The sky is still mostly clear, but a faint haze hangs low along the horizon. At first it looks like distant fog, though you quickly learn that fog is not common in this dry country. It is dust, fine soil drifting slowly through the air. A few chickens scratch near the barn, kicking at the ground in search of insects. Their feathers ruffle when a small gust of wind passes through. Even the animals seem slightly uneasy today. You follow the farmer toward the barn, where sacks of feed are stacked against the wall. He pours a careful portion into a trough for the chickens, and another for the pigs in a nearby pen. Feed must be rationed now. With crop yields falling, buying large quantities of grain becomes difficult. Many farmers begin reducing their livestock numbers simply because feeding them becomes too expensive. You lean against the fence and watch the animals eat. The quiet routine feels strangely peaceful, yet the land around you tells a different story. The fields remain dry. The wind continues its slow, restless movement across the ground. Scientists studying the Dust Bowl decades later pointed out that the Great Plains had experienced droughts before. Dry cycles were not unusual in this region. What made the 1930s disaster so severe was the combination of drought and massive areas of exposed farmland. Researchers still debate exactly how much responsibility should fall on farming practices versus natural climate patterns. Some argue that deep ploughing destroyed protective grasses that once anchored the soil. Others emphasize that the drought itself was unusually intense. Standing here now, those debates feel distant. For the families living through it, the question is not who caused the problem. The question is how to survive it. You notice the farmer studying the sky again. Weather watching becomes a kind of daily ritual on the plains. People look for any sign of clouds, any shift in the wind that might bring rain. Today the sky offers little encouragement, only pale blue emptiness stretching endlessly above. Still life continues with surprising resilience. Around mid-morning a truck rattles down the dirt road that passes the farmhouse. It belongs to a neighbour from a nearby farm. The driver slows and raises a hand in greeting as he passes. Neighbours keep a close eye on one another out here. Communities across the plains depend heavily on cooperation. If a tractor breaks down, someone nearby might lend tools or spare parts. If a family falls behind on chores, neighbours sometimes help gather crops or repair buildings. Hardship tends to strengthen those quiet bonds. You stand for a moment watching the truck disappear into the dusty distance. Then the farmer heads back toward the fields again. The day's work continues, even when the harvest looks uncertain. The wind stirs a little stronger now, sending loose soil sliding across the ground in thin drifting lines. You feel the grains of dust brush against your skin. At first it seems harmless, just another breezy day on the plains. But as you watch the faint haze gathering along the horizon, you begin to sense the land preparing for something larger. The wind is learning how to carry the soil, and soon it will discover just how much there is to take. The morning grows brighter as the sun climbs higher above the plains, though the light feels strangely thin. It washes across the land without warmth, illuminating a landscape that looks more tired than lively. You stand near the farmhouse yard, watching a group of children moving across the dirt path that leads toward the road. They are walking to school. Their steps send small puffs of dust rising around their shoes. Each child carries a small satchel or bundle of books tied with string. The wind tugs at their clothing and ruffles their hair, but none of them seem particularly bothered by it. Children growing up in the Dust Bowl learn very early that dust is simply part of life. You fall into step behind them as they head down the road. The walk to school can take a while, depending on where the farm lies. Some children travel a mile or more each morning across open fields and dirt tracks. The road stretches ahead like a pale ribbon through the dry countryside. Fence posts lean slightly from years of wind, and thin weeds cling stubbornly to the roadside. One boy stops briefly to kick at a small drift of soil gathered against a fence. The dust scatters into the air like powder. He laughs and keeps walking. To him, it is just another ordinary morning. Across rural America in the early 1930s, small one-room schoolhouses served many farming communities. These buildings often held students of several ages learning together under the guidance of a single teacher. Younger children practice reading while older students work through arithmetic or geography lessons. When you reach the schoolhouse, it looks exactly like the kind of building you might picture in an old storybook. A small wooden structure sits beside the road with tall windows and a narrow bell tower rising from the roof. The bell rings as the children arrive. Inside the classroom smells faintly of chalk dust, wood polish, and wool coats drying near the stove. Rows of simple desks fill the room, each one carved with little scratches and initials from past students. The teacher stands at the front writing letters across a chalkboard. You notice something almost humorous when you glance around the room. Despite all the dust outside, the teacher spends a surprising amount of time trying to keep the classroom tidy. A broom leans in the corner and the floor has been carefully swept. An unusual detail from this era is that some teachers in the Dust Bowl region kept damp cloths near the windows so students could wipe their faces during particularly dusty days. Children would arrive at school with fine layers of soil clinging to their skin, eyelashes and hair. It became normal to brush the dust away before starting a lesson. The morning class begins with reading practice. Young voices fill the room as students take turns standing beside their desks to recite passages from a textbook. The sound blends with the faint whistle of wind outside the building. You sit quietly near the back watching the scene unfold. Even in the middle of a growing environmental disaster, daily routines continue. Education remains important to these families. Parents believe strongly that schooling might open doors their children could use one day, perhaps somewhere beyond the struggling farms. During recess, the children rush outside with sudden bursts of energy. They scatter across the yard, playing simple games, kicking a worn ball or chasing each other across the dusty ground. Laughter echoes across the open land. The wind lifts little spirals of soil that swirl briefly around their feet. Some of the children barely notice it. A few older students glance towards the horizon though. They have lived long enough to recognize certain patterns in the weather. When the sky begins to take on a pale brown haze, it often means stronger winds may arrive later. Records from agricultural observers during the 1930s note that many dust storms began with small drifting clouds before growing into massive walls of airborne soil. At first they appeared harmless. Only later did their full power become clear. Back inside the classroom, the teacher moves on to a geography lesson. A large map of the United States hangs on the wall, its colours slightly faded with age. The teacher points out rivers, mountains, and cities that many of the students have never seen. Places like Chicago, New York, and San Francisco sound almost magical compared to the quiet farms of the plains. One girl studies the map carefully. Perhaps she imagines travelling someday. Perhaps she simply enjoys the idea that the world is bigger than the dusty road outside. Researchers examining childhood during the Dust Bowl years often discuss how quickly young people matured in farming communities. Many children balance school with long hours of chores at home. Feeding animals, carrying water, repairing fences, and helping in the fields were all part of daily life. Some scholars propose that this early responsibility created a generation known for remarkable resilience. Others believe it also carried emotional burdens that were not always visible at the time. When the school day finally ends, the bell rings again and the children gather their books. They step outside into the afternoon light. The wind has grown stronger. You can see it moving across the fields, now pushing long sheets of loose soil along the ground. The horizon looks slightly darker than it did that morning. One boy squints toward the distant sky and says something quietly to his friend. You cannot hear the words, but the tone carries a hint of concern. The walk home begins. Dust trails behind the children as they move along the road again. Their footsteps stir the earth, blending with the restless wind that never seems to fully stop blowing across these plains. You glance back at the schoolhouse one last time. The building stands firm against the open land, its bell tower pointing upward toward the wide sky. Inside those wooden walls, lessons continue day after day. Reading, arithmetic, geography, small piece of knowledge carried forward into an uncertain future. And as the children disappear down the dusty road toward their farms, the wind quietly gathers strength across the fields that surround them. The land is shifting again, grain by grain, waiting for the moment when the sky itself might begin to darken. The afternoon begins quietly, the kind of calm that might almost convince you the plains have decided to behave themselves for a while. You walk back toward the farmhouse, with the children's distant voices fading behind you. The road stretches ahead, pale and dusty, with the farm buildings slowly growing larger against the horizon. Yet something in the air feels different now. The wind is still blowing, but its tone has changed. Earlier, it brushed softly across the fields. Now it carries a sharper edge, sliding across the land with restless energy. The grass along the fence lines bends in one direction, trembling as if the ground itself is uneasy. You pause near the barn and look toward the western sky. That faint haze from earlier has thickened. At first it resembles a distant cloud bank, low and stretched along the horizon. But as you continue watching, the shape grows taller. The colour shifts slowly from pale grey to a deeper shade of brown. Inside the farmhouse, the woman notices it too. She steps out onto the porch, shading her eyes with one hand. The farmer joins her a moment later. Neither of them speaks at first. They simply watch. By the early 1930s, dust storms had begun appearing with increasing frequency across the Great Plains. Contemporary weather observers recorded dozens of major storms each year in some regions. What made these storms especially frightening was how quickly they could grow. A small line of blowing soil on the horizon might transform into a massive wall of dust stretching thousands of feet into the sky. Standing here now, you're watching one of those walls begin to rise. The farmer exhales slowly. He has seen storms before, but the sight never becomes comfortable. The line of dust continues to swell as the wind strengthens. You can now see it rolling across the distant fields like a moving cliff. The sunlight above it dims slightly, as if someone has placed a thin veil over the sky. The air begins to smell different as well. Dry earth, hot soil, a faint gritty scent that reminds you of freshly ploughed ground, though far stronger. A curious detail from people who lived through these storms is how many of them compared the approaching dust clouds to enormous ocean waves. They describe watching a dark, rolling mass rise along the horizon, advancing slowly but relentlessly across the land. Except this wave was made of soil instead of water. The farmer moves quickly now. He begins securing loose items around the yard. A metal bucket is turned upside down. The barn doors are pulled shut and latched. Chickens are guided toward their coop with firm gestures. Everyone knows the routine. Dust storms demand preparation. You help carry a few tools inside while the wind begins pushing harder against the side of the house. The porch boards creak faintly beneath your feet. When you glance west again, the sight is startling. The dust wall has grown enormous. It stretches across the entire horizon like a dark curtain being drawn across the sky. The upper edge curls and folds as powerful air currents lift millions of tiny soil particles into the atmosphere. Sunlight fades further. The colour of the land begins to change. The woman opens the front door and gestures for everyone to come inside. Windows are closed tightly. Towels are pushed into cracks along the doorframe. These simple barriers offer only partial protection, but they are better than nothing. You step into the kitchen just as the wind surges again. This time it arrives with force. The first wave of dust slams against the walls of the house with a muffled thump that makes the windows rattle sharply in their frames. A strange dimness fills the room, even though it is still early afternoon. Within minutes, the sky outside darkens dramatically. Dust begins forcing its way through the smallest openings. Tiny grains slip along the window edges and collect on the floor in faint brown streaks. Inside the house, the air feels heavier. You hear the wind roaring outside like distant thunder. Weather reports from the Dust Bowl era describe storms so intense that visibility sometimes dropped to only a few feet. In certain cases, people walking outdoors became disoriented and struggled to find their way back to buildings just a short distance away. These storms earned the nickname Black Blizzards because they resembled winter snowstorms, except the swirling particles were made of soil rather than ice. You move toward the window and peer through the glass. The view has almost disappeared. Where the open fields once stretched across the landscape, you now see a thick brown darkness swirling violently through the air. The world beyond the house has been swallowed. Inside the farmer lights a kerosene lamp, even though it is still daytime. The soft yellow glow spreads across the kitchen table. Dust continues slipping into the room in fine drifting lines, an odd practice some families developed during severe storms involved placing damp cloths over their mouths and noses while indoors. The moisture helped catch tiny dust particles before they could be inhaled. You notice the woman tying a cloth loosely around her face now. The wind howls louder. It presses against the walls with steady pressure, shaking the house slightly as gusts surge across the open plains. Occasionally something taps against the exterior boards, perhaps a loose branch or debris carried by the storm. You sit quietly at the table while the storm rages outside. No one talks much. Instead, you listen to the sounds of the wind, the rattle of windows, and the soft scrape of dust drifting along the floorboards. Researchers who later examined the environmental disaster often pointed to a combination of severe drought and widespread ploughing as the ingredients that allowed these enormous dust storms to form. With native prairie grasses gone, the soil had little protection against strong winds. The land itself had become airborne. After what feels like a very long time, the roaring wind begins to soften slightly. The darkness outside grows lighter by degrees. When you finally open the door, a crack, and look out, the world appears transformed. A thick coat of dust covers everything. The porch, the fence posts, the barn roof, even the windmill blades are coated with a dull brown layer. The sky above slowly brightens again, though the air still holds a faint haze. The farmer steps outside and studies the fields. He knows that every storm like this steals a little more of the land. Grain by grain, field by field, And as you stand beside him in the dusty afternoon light, you realise the storms are no longer distant threats. They have arrived. When the storm finally loosens its grip on the farmhouse, the world outside looks as though it has been quietly buried. You step onto the porch beside the farmer and feel the strange stillness that often follows a dust storm. The wind has weakened for the moment, leaving the air heavy and muted. The sky above is pale again, but the sunlight looks dull, filtered through a lingering haze of fine soil. Everything carries the same colour now, brown. The porch floor is covered with a thin blanket of powder. Fence posts stand half buried in drifts that gathered against their bases. Even the windmill that pumps water for the farm looks as if someone dusted it with flour. The farmer rubs a hand along the porch railing and lifts his palm to inspect it. A layer of soil coats his skin. He brushes it away slowly though. Both of you know the effort will only last a few minutes before another thin film settles over everything again. Across the Dust Bowl region, families quickly discovered that cleaning became one of the most constant tasks of daily life. Dust did not simply arrive during storms and disappear afterward. It remained in the air for hours or even days, drifting steadily through houses and barns. You step back into the kitchen and notice how quickly the dust has already returned. Fine grains gather along the table edge and windowsill. A narrow brown trail stretches across the floor where the wind forced soil beneath the door. The woman reaches for the broom again. She moves quietly around the room, sweeping the dust into small piles that she collects with a metal pan. The broom bristles whisper softly against the wooden boards. It is a sound she hears many times every day. An unusual little habit recorded in several Dust Bowl diaries involved placing damp cloths over furniture and dishes during heavy storm seasons. The moisture helped trap floating particles before they could settle everywhere. Even so, dust found its way into almost everything. People sometimes joked that they could taste the soil in their food. You walk toward the sink, where a basin of water sits ready for washing dishes. A thin film of dirt floats along the surface, carried in through the air. The woman sighs gently and replaces the water. Moments like this show how the disaster shaped even the smallest routines of daily life. Outside, the farmer begins brushing dust from the barn doors. He works with steady movements, though it is clear the effort feels somewhat pointless. A new breeze lifts across the yard and carries another swirl of soil along the ground. The barn door becomes dusty again almost immediately. Still he continues cleaning. Agricultural reports, written during the mid-1930s, described how dust storms stripped enormous quantities of topsoil from farmland across the plains. This top layer of soil contained valuable nutrients necessary for growing crops. Losing it made farming even more difficult in the following seasons. You walk out to the yard and glance across the fields. The surface of the land looks slightly different now. Smooth ridges have formed where the wind pushed soil into long, shallow drifts. In other places, the ground appears scraped bare. Nature has quietly rearranged the farm again. A few chickens wander cautiously from their coop, pecking at the ground as if testing whether the world has returned to normal. They leave delicate tracks in the fresh dust coating the yard. The farmer leans against the fence and studies the horizon. Storms rarely arrive alone during the Dust Bowl years. Often, another cloud of dust follows hours or days later. Weather observers from the time noted that some regions experienced weeks when the sky remained hazy almost continuously. Living under those conditions required patience that seems almost unimaginable. You return to the house and step into the small living room, where a narrow sofa rests beside a wooden radio cabinet. Dust has settled along the radio's polished surface in a faint grey film. The woman wipes it away carefully with a cloth. Radios were becoming increasingly common in American homes during the 1930s. They served as a vital connection to the outside world, especially for rural families living far from towns. Through radio broadcasts, people heard news reports, weather forecasts and music drifting in from distant cities. Sometimes the radio also delivered advice about coping with the growing environmental crisis. Experts from agricultural colleges began sharing suggestions on soil conservation and drought management. Farmers listened closely, hoping to find any strategy that might help protect their land. Researchers studying the period often point out that the Dust Bowl eventually pushed the United States government to promote new farming techniques designed to prevent erosion. Ideas such as crop rotation, contour ploughing and planting windbreaks slowly gained attention. At this moment though, those large-scale changes still lie in the future. Right now families focus on surviving one storm at a time. You sit quietly by the window while the afternoon drifts forward. The sky has regained some brightness, though the air remains hazy. Sunlight glows faintly through the dust floating high above the plains. From somewhere down the road, you hear the faint rumble of a truck engine. A neighbour is probably passing by to check on nearby farms. Community connections grow stronger during difficult times like these. People share news, lend equipment, and sometimes simply stop by to see how others are managing. Small gestures carry enormous meaning when everyone is facing the same challenge. The farmer returns to the house and removes his hat, shaking a cloud of dust from the brim before stepping inside. A thin ring of soil falls onto the floor where he stands. He gives a tired smile and brushes it away with his boot. Cleaning begins again. The broom moves across the floor. Cloths wipe the windowsills. Dust gathers into piles, only to return later in the day. It is a quiet cycle that repeats itself endlessly throughout Dust Bowl homes. You sit there listening to the soft sweep of the broom and the gentle hum of wind outside. The storm has passed for now, but the land beyond the house still looks fragile. Loose soil waits across the fields, and the impatient, as always, will eventually return to claim it. The morning after the storm begins with a pale quiet that almost feels cautious, as if the land itself is pausing to see what will happen next. You step outside the farmhouse just after sunrise and notice how the air feels heavier than usual. The wind has not completely vanished, but it moves more slowly now, brushing across the plains like someone turning pages in a large dusty book. The yard looks different than it did yesterday. A thin crust of soil covers nearly everything. Fence rails wear soft brown caps. The porch steps show faint ridges where drifting dust piled up during the night. Even the tracks left by the chickens have disappeared beneath a fresh layer of powder. You take a few steps across the yard and feel the ground shift slightly beneath your boots. It is not solid the way farmland should be. Instead, the soil behaves like loose sand. The farmer is already awake. You see him standing near the windmill examining the base of the tower where dust has collected in thick drifts. He pushes the soil aside with the toe of his boot and shakes his head slightly. Another storm has taken a little more of the land. Across the Great Plains, during the mid-1930s, federal agencies began documenting the enormous scale of soil loss caused by these storms. Surveys conducted by agricultural officials eventually estimated that hundreds of millions of tons of topsoil had been lifted into the air and carried across the country. Standing here, those numbers are impossible to imagine. What you can see is the slow thinning of the fields that once supported entire families. You walk over to join the farmer, and together you watch the windmill blades turning slowly above. Their steady creak breaks the quiet morning. Not long ago, people across the region believed the land would always provide generous harvests. Wheat prices had once been high enough to encourage farmers to plough more and more prairie grassland. Now that decision feels different. Government officials in Washington have begun paying closer attention to what is happening across the plains. The environmental disaster has grown too large to ignore. During the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, several new programs were created as part of the broader effort to lift the country out of the Great Depression. Among them were initiatives designed to help struggling farmers and repair damaged farmland. You hear the rumble of a truck approaching along the dusty road. The sound grows louder until a government vehicle rolls slowly into the yard. A man wearing a broad hat climbs out and greets the farmer with a polite nod. He introduces himself as a representative from the Soil Conservation Service. The name might sound official and slightly mysterious, but the idea behind it is straightforward. The government has begun sending specialists across the Dust Bowl region to study the damaged land and suggest new farming methods that might prevent further soil loss. You watch as the visitor kneels in the field and scoops up a handful of dirt. He lets it fall through his fingers just the way you did on your first morning here. The powder drifts away immediately. Agricultural bulletins distributed during this period often explained that deep ploughing had left fields vulnerable once drought removed the protective moisture from the soil. Without plant roots or natural grasses holding the ground together, strong winds could easily carry it away. The visitor speaks calmly with the farmer about possible solutions. He describes techniques such as contour ploughing, which follows the natural curves of the land instead of cutting straight rows across the fields. This method helps slow the movement of wind and water. Another idea involves planting strips of crops separated by grass barriers that anchor the soil. You listen quietly while they talk. These suggestions may sound simple, but implementing them requires time, equipment, and sometimes money that farmers do not always possess. Still, the conversation carries a hint of cautious hope. The government is finally paying attention. A little known detail from this period involves a massive project that would soon begin across the plains. The federal government planned to plant enormous lines of trees stretching from Texas all the way to the Canadian border. The goal was to create windbreaks capable of slowing the powerful gusts that swept across the open land. At the moment, though, that plan remains mostly an idea sketched out in reports and meetings. Back in the yard, the visitor pulls a folded map from his truck and spreads it across the hood. He points out regions where conservation projects will begin first. The farmer studies the map carefully. For people who have spent their entire lives relying on the land, accepting outside guidance can feel unusual. Yet the storms have changed things. The old methods are no longer working. Environmental historians examining this period often explore an important question. Did the Dust Bowl force American agriculture to evolve more rapidly than it otherwise might have? Some specialists believe the disaster accelerated the development of modern soil conservation practices. Others suggest those changes would eventually have happened anyway. Standing here beside the truck, the debate feels distant. What matters is whether the land can recover. The visitor eventually climbs back into his vehicle and waves goodbye as he drives off down the road. The engine noise fades into the quiet morning. The farmer remains standing near the field for a long moment. He looks across the land as if imagining how it might change. Perhaps rows of new crops planted differently. Perhaps long lines of trees rising along the horizon. Perhaps simply rain returning to the plains. You follow his gaze out toward the distant sky. The air remains hazy, though the sunlight grows brighter as the morning continues. Dust still lingers above the land, drifting invisibly on gentle currents of wind. Life on the farm continues. Animals must be fed. Tools need repairing. The soil must be worked, even if its future feels uncertain. You walk back toward the house while the farmer gathers his equipment. Behind you, the fields stretch wide beneath the pale sky. And somewhere beyond the horizon, new ideas about saving the land are beginning to take root. Later that afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the farm begins to shift again. The sky remains hazy but brighter than the day before, and the wind drifts across the land with a calmer voice. You are standing near the fence when another truck appears along the road, raising a thin trail of dust behind its tyres. The driver slows before reaching the gate. It is the same neighbour you noticed passing earlier in the week. He climbs down from the truck and tips his hat in greeting, his boots landing softly in the powdery soil. Visits like this are rarely formal. Out here, people stop by simply to check how things are going. Hard years have a way of pulling neighbours closer together. You walk toward the yard with the farmer while the visitor leans against the side of his truck. For a few moments, the conversation stays light. They speak about the weather, the stubborn wind, and the strange colour the sky has taken on these days. Eventually, the talk turns toward the fields. Both men glance across the farm. Neither of them looks particularly hopeful. Across many farming communities during the Great Depression, cooperation became one of the most valuable survival tools available. Period accounts from rural newspapers describe neighbours sharing equipment, exchanging labour, and occasionally pooling supplies when harvests fell short. Farming has always involved some level of mutual help, but the Dust Bowl years deepened those connections. You notice the neighbour studying the barn roof, which still carries a layer of dust from yesterday's storm. He laughs quietly and says his own place looks even worse. In fact, he mentions that his family spent half the night sweeping soil from the kitchen floor. An unexpected little anecdote from the region tells how some households kept a broom in nearly every room during the worst Dust Bowl years. That way, anyone who noticed drifting dust could start cleaning immediately without searching for tools. The neighbour eventually pulls a small crate from the back of his truck. Inside are several jars and a sack tied with twine. He hands them to the farmer with a casual shrug, explaining that his wife canned more beans than they can possibly eat before the next season. The farmer accepts the gift with quiet gratitude. In exchange, he offers a bundle of spare fence wire that the neighbour had mentioned needing earlier in the week. Nothing about the exchange feels like charity. It is simply the way things work here. Barter and informal trade become increasingly common when money grows scarce. With the national economy struggling during the Great Depression, cash is not always easy to find. People rely more heavily on goods and favours. You carry the crate of jars into the kitchen while the two men continue talking outside. The woman at the stove examines the jars with a warm smile. The glass containers hold preserved beans, their green colour glowing faintly through the dusty sunlight that filters into the room. Food like this is valuable. A steady supply of preserved vegetables can stretch meals for weeks. You place the jars carefully on a shelf, beside the others already stored there. The small pantry is beginning to look more hopeful. Outside, the men walk toward the fields together. You follow at a distance, listening as they discuss the changes happening across the region. Several nearby farms have already sent family members west in search of work. Others are holding on, hoping the drought might finally break. The neighbour mentions hearing that another large storm struck towns farther south earlier in the week. According to reports carried by travelling salesmen and truck drivers, entire streets disappeared behind thick walls of dust. Regional weather observers during the 1930s documented storms that carried soil hundreds of miles across the country. Some dust from the plains even reached cities along the eastern coast of the United States. Imagining that journey feels almost surreal. The soil beneath your feet drifting all the way across the continent. The men stop near the edge of the wheat field. They bend down and examine the fragile plants pushing through the soil. The stalks look thin but stubborn, reaching upward despite the harsh conditions. Agricultural researchers studying this period often explore a complicated question. Did the farmers of the plains remain too optimistic about saving their land? Or was that determination the very reason many communities survived at all? Different experts offer different interpretations. Some argue that perseverance allowed families to endure until better conditions arrived. Others suggest that leaving earlier might have prevented years of hardship. Listening to the conversation in the field, you sense that such questions matter little to the people living through the experience. Leaving is never an easy choice. This land holds their homes, their memories, and the graves of relatives who helped build these farms. The neighbour eventually checks his watch and decides it is time to return home. Before climbing into his truck, he pauses beside the gate. The two farmers shake hands with a quiet firmness that speaks of mutual respect. No dramatic words are exchanged, just a few simple wishes for good weather and safe days ahead. The truck engine rumbles to life and the vehicle rolls slowly down the road. Dust rises behind it in a thin, drifting cloud that fades gradually into the hazy air. You stand beside the farmer watching until the truck disappears over the distant rise. Moments like this reveal how important community becomes during difficult times. No one here can stop the wind. No one can command the rain to return. But neighbours can share tools. They can trade food. They can check on each other after storms and lend a hand when fences collapse or animals wander. The afternoon grows quieter as the sun lowers slightly in the sky. You head back toward the farmhouse where the woman is already preparing the evening meal. Behind you, the fields stretch across the plains, fragile yet enduring. And somewhere along the dusty road, another neighbour might already be driving toward a different farm, carrying a small crate of supplies and a few words of encouragement. The next morning arrives with a pale golden light stretching across the plains. You step outside just after dawn and feel the cool air brushing gently against your face. For once the wind is quiet. The stillness feels almost unusual after so many restless days. From the porch you can see the wheat field spreading out beyond the barn. The plants are thin and uneven, but they are still alive. Their narrow green blades tremble slightly as a faint breeze passes over the land. The farmer is already working. You spot him near the edge of the field, guiding a small tractor slowly through the soil. The machine rattles loudly in the quiet morning, its metal frame vibrating as it moves across the rough ground. Even during years when crops struggle, the routine of farming continues. You walk toward the field, noticing how the earth looks both soft and brittle at the same time. Each step sends a small puff of dust into the air. The soil seems to float rather than settle. Farmers across the Great Plains in the 1930s were still trying to grow wheat despite the drought and blowing soil. Agricultural records from the decade indicate that wheat remained the dominant crop across large areas of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado, even as harvests became increasingly unpredictable. For many families, wheat was not simply a crop. It was their entire livelihood. The tractor comes to a stop when the farmer notices you approaching. He wipes sweat from his forehead with a cloth and looks out across the uneven rows of plants. You follow his gaze. The wheat stands in scattered patches rather than smooth lines. In some places, the plants seem healthy enough. In others, the soil lies bare where seeds never manage to sprout. A curious observation recorded by several Dust Bowl farmers involved how quickly the wind could erase the careful work of planting. Seeds placed neatly into the ground one day might vanish completely after a single strong storm lifted the soil away. It sometimes felt as though the land was slowly undoing every effort to cultivate it. The farmer kneels and digs a small hole with his hands. He examines the roots of one fragile wheat plant. They reach only a short distance into the ground before meeting dry powder. Without moisture, the plant has little chance to grow tall. You stand quietly while he studies the soil. Farming requires patience even in the best years. During the Dust Bowl era, that patience often stretched to its limits. Across nearby counties, farmers experimented with different strategies to keep their crops alive. Some planted drought-resistant varieties of wheat that could survive with less water. Others attempted to leave certain fields unploughed so that natural grasses might return and anchor the soil. These adjustments were still new ideas, and not everyone agreed on which methods worked best. Environmental historians, examining the Dust Bowl, frequently discuss how farmers balance tradition with experimentation during these years. Many agricultural practices had been passed down through generations, making sudden changes difficult to accept. Yet the storms forced people to reconsider what they thought they knew about the land. The farmer stands and walks farther into the field. You follow along a narrow path between the rows. The wheat rustles softly as the wind passes through it, producing a delicate whispering sound that spreads across the field. For a moment, the farm almost feels peaceful again. Birds glide overhead, searching for insects hiding among the plants. A meadowlark lands on a fence post and begins singing its clear, bright song. Life continues in small ways, even when the larger environment struggles. The farmer pauses near a patch of bare soil where the crop never appeared. He pushes his boot gently into the ground. The earth collapses inward like loose flour. This field once held thick stands of wheat reaching nearly to a man's waist during healthy seasons. Now large sections remain empty. You can sense the quiet frustration in his posture. Still he keeps working. After a few minutes, he climbs back onto the tractor and starts the engine again. The machine rattles forward slowly, turning the soil in careful lines. The goal is to prepare the ground in ways that might protect it from future storms. Each pass of the tractor creates low ridges that break the wind slightly as it moves across the field. From a distance, the pattern almost resembles gentle waves on water. By mid-morning, the sun climbs higher and the temperature begins to rise. Heat spreads across the plains, drying the soil even further. You sit on the fence rail and watch the tractor continue its slow progress. Dust lifts behind the wheels in faint drifting clouds. Several agricultural advisors working in the region during the 1930s encouraged farmers to plough along curved lines that followed the natural slope of the land. This approach helped prevent wind and rain from sweeping directly across large open fields. At the time, the technique still felt unfamiliar to many farmers who were used to straight rows. Learning new methods while facing financial hardship required a kind of quiet courage. Eventually, the farmer shuts off the tractor and climbs down. He walks over to the fence and takes a long drink from a metal canteen. Sweat has darkened the collar of his shirt and dust clings to his boots. You both look across the field again. Despite the damage, small patches of wheat continue pushing upward. Their green colour stands out against the dull brown soil. It is a modest sign of persistence. In places like this, survival often depends on small victories. A few rows of healthy plants. A successful repair to a broken fence. A neighbour arriving with extra jars of preserved food. The farmer sets the canteen down and wipes his hands on a cloth. Work will continue through the afternoon, preparing the soil as best as possible before the next storm arrives. Because everyone living on these plains understands one thing very clearly: the wind will return, and when it does, the fields must be ready to face it again. By late afternoon, the farmhouse settles into a quieter rhythm again. The tractor has fallen silent in the field, and the sun drifts slowly toward the western horizon. You step back inside the house, brushing dust from your sleeves as you cross the doorway. Even after the cleaning earlier, a fine layer of soil has already returned. It rests lightly across the table, the radio cabinet, and the wooden floorboards near the door. The dust does not arrive dramatically now. Instead, it drifts in patiently grain by grain, as though the land itself is slowly trying to move indoors. The woman stands near the kitchen window, wiping the glass with a damp cloth. She works, slowly pressing the fabric against the wood frame where small lines of dirt have gathered. Keeping a house clean during the Dust Bowl years often felt like trying to empty a river with a spoon. You pull out a chair at the table and sit down, listening to the quiet creak of the house settling in the afternoon heat. Outside, a faint breeze pushes against the walls with a soft sighing sound. The farmhouse itself is built simply but solidly. Thick wooden boards form the outer walls. The roof slopes gently above a narrow attic space where spare tools and old trunks are stored. Every corner of the house carries the signs of long use. Scratches mark the table surface. The kitchen floor shows faint grooves worn by years of footsteps. Yet the structure still stands firm against the wind. Reports written by housing inspectors during the 1930s revealed that many rural homes across the Great Plains were modest wooden structures like this one. Families often built them themselves or purchased them through local lumber yards during earlier decades of farming expansion. These houses were sturdy, but they had never been designed to keep out constant storms of airborne soil. You walk toward the living room and run your hand along the back of the sofa. Dust clings to the fabric instantly. The woman notices and smiles faintly. She hands you a small cloth and gestures toward the radio cabinet. Cleaning has become a shared activity. A small but memorable habit on many Dust Bowl farms involved placing folded newspapers along window sills and door frames. The paper acted as a barrier that caught drifting dust before it reached deeper into the house. When the pages filled with dirt, they could simply be replaced. You spread the cloth across the radio and wipe the polished surface gently. The radio itself is a proud possession in this household. Its wooden case gleams warmly whenever the dust is cleared away. A circular dial sits at the centre, surrounded by numbers that mark distant broadcast stations. During the 1930s, radios connected rural families to the wider world in ways that had never been possible before. You turn the knob carefully. The speaker crackles softly before a voice emerges through the static. A news announcer is speaking about economic recovery programs being organised in Washington. The words drift through the room in a calm, measured tone. Across the country, the federal government was launching a series of initiatives aimed at helping Americans survive the hardships of the Great Depression. Many of these programs would eventually reach rural communities struggling with drought and dust storms. The farmer enters the room just as the broadcast begins describing new agricultural assistance efforts. He pauses beside the radio, listening closely. For people living far from major towns, these broadcasts often served as their primary source of information about national events. Outside the window, the wind rises slightly, rattling the loose edge of a screen. You glance toward the horizon, half expecting another dark wall of dust to appear. For now, the sky remains calm. While the news continues, the woman brings a small basket to the table filled with mending supplies. A shirt with a torn sleeve rests across her lap. She threads a needle and begins stitching carefully under the soft glow of the lamp. Evenings often bring small quiet tasks like this. Clothes are repaired rather than replaced whenever possible. During the economic hardship of the 1930s, many families learned to stretch their possessions as long as they could. Fabric scraps sometimes found second lives as patches, quilts, or even simple toys for children. Historians who examine domestic life during the Dust Bowl period frequently reflect on how households became centres of constant adaptation. Families developed creative solutions for almost every shortage they encountered. Cooking, clothing, cleaning, and even entertainment required improvisation. You finish wiping the radio cabinet and sit back in the chair while the broadcast shifts to a weather report. The announcer mentions dry conditions across several states in the Plains region. He also notes that wind activity is expected to remain high over the coming days. The farmer exhales slowly. Weather forecasts were still relatively simple during this era, relying on limited data compared to modern predictions. Yet even these basic reports offered valuable hints about what farmers might face in the days ahead. You stand and walk toward the window again. The sun is now sinking lower, painting the sky in soft orange tones. Light spreads across the dusty fields in long golden streaks. Despite everything, the landscape can still look beautiful at this hour. The wheat plants catch the sunlight and glow faintly green against the darker soil. For a moment, the hardships of the past days seem distant. Inside the house, the radio continues murmuring softly. The woman ties off the final stitch on the repaired sleeve and folds the shirt neatly beside her sewing basket. Evening is approaching. Soon the lamps will be lit, supper will be prepared, and the family will gather again at the table. Life inside the farmhouse moves forward quietly, shaped by routine and resilience. Outside, the wind slides gently across the fields, and somewhere beyond the fading horizon, the plains continue waiting for the rain that has not yet returned. Evening settles slowly across the plains, and with it comes a gentle quiet that wraps around the farmhouse like a blanket. The sky fades from pale orange to a deepening shade of blue, and the last warmth of the sun slips behind the distant horizon. You sit near the kitchen window, listening to the windmill turning outside its steady creak, marking the passage of time. Inside the house, supper has just finished. The dishes are stacked beside the sink, and the faint smell of cooked beans still lingers in the air. Lamps glow softly on the table, and near the sofa casting warm circles of light against the wooden walls. For a brief moment, the world feels calm, yet life in the Dust Bowl carries challenges that do not end when the storms pass. You notice the farmer clearing his throat quietly as he sits back in his chair. The sound is dry and persistent, like someone trying to remove dust from deep in the chest. The woman glances at him with mild concern. Coughing has become a familiar sound in many homes across the region. Medical reports from the 1930s describe how the constant presence of airborne soil created serious respiratory problems for thousands of people living in the Dust Bowl states. Fine particles carried by the wind could easily enter the lungs, especially during heavy storms. Doctors eventually gave a name to one of the most troubling conditions: dust pneumonia. You rise from the table and walk toward the window. Outside the yard lies quiet beneath the dim evening light. The dust that blew through earlier storms now rests quietly along the ground, but the air still carries tiny invisible particles. Breathing them day after day slowly wears on the body. The farmer coughs again and reaches for a tin cup of water. He drinks slowly, then nods as if assuring everyone that he is fine. Across the plains, families learn to develop small habits aimed at protecting their health during these years. Damp cloths placed over windows and doors help reduce the amount of dust entering homes. Some people even tied pieces of fabric over their mouths during severe storms. One lesser-known detail from local hospital records mentions that nurses sometimes placed bowls of water beside sick patients to keep the air slightly moist, hoping the moisture would help settle the dust particles floating indoors. Whether these methods truly helped remained uncertain, but people tried whatever remedies they could. You sit again near the table while the radio hums quietly in the background. The broadcast now carries a program of gentle music, a fiddle accompanied by soft guitar chords. The melody floats through the room, blending with the steady whisper of wind outside. The farmer leans back in his chair and closes his eyes for a moment, listening. Moments like this offer small relief from the pressures of farm life. During the Dust Bowl years, medical care in rural communities often required long journeys to the nearest town. Many farms sat miles away from doctors or hospitals. When illness struck, families frequently relied on home remedies until professional help could be reached. County health reports from the era show that respiratory illnesses increased noticeably in regions affected by severe dust storms. Still, people carried on with daily life. You notice the woman gathering a small wooden box from a cupboard. Inside are simple medical supplies kept for household use. A bottle of cough syrup, a thermometer, and a few bandages lie neatly arranged inside. She places the bottle near the farmer's cup. He smiles faintly and thanks her before taking a small sip. The medicine tastes strongly of herbs and sugar. Medical historians often explore how rural communities balance traditional remedies with emerging modern treatments during the early 20th century. Many households still relied on folk knowledge passed down through generations, even as new scientific approaches slowly became available. Out on the plains, practicality usually guided decisions. If something seemed to help, people kept using it. The wind outside begins to strengthen slightly as the evening grows darker. It brushes against the farmhouse walls with a gentle scraping sound, carrying grains of dust across the yard. You step outside for a moment to feel the air. The temperature has cooled, and the sky above now glitters with scattered stars. In the distance, a faint haze still hangs along the horizon, barely visible in the starlight. Dust lingers even on calm nights. The windmill turns slowly against the dark sky, its silhouette rising above the barn roof. Standing there, you realise how quiet the plains can become once night arrives. The world stretches wide and empty in every direction. Only the wind moves. Back inside the farmhouse, the radio music continues softly. The farmer's coughing has eased, and he sits comfortably near the table, while the woman folds a few cloths beside the lamp. Life continues with quiet determination. The storms may return tomorrow. The wind may carry more soil across the fields. But tonight the farmhouse stands warm and steady against the darkness. You settle into a chair and listen to the gentle sounds of the house at night. The faint creak of wooden beams, the low hum of the radio, the whisper of wind across the plains. And in that calm moment, the people inside this small farmhouse gather their strength for whatever the next day might bring. Morning comes quietly again, though the sky carries the familiar pale haze that has become part of life on the plains. You step outside the farmhouse just as the first light spreads across the land. The windmill turns slowly against the brightening horizon, and the cool air smells faintly of dry earth. The farmer is already awake and feeding the animals near the barn. You walk across the yard, your boots leaving shallow prints in the powdery soil that still coats the ground from earlier storms. Chickens wander nearby, scratching carefully at the surface in search of insects. Another day has begun. But today, you are not heading toward the fields. Instead, you join the group of children once again as they set out along the dusty road toward the schoolhouse. Their voices carry softly through the morning air as they talk about lessons, chores waiting at home, and the latest storm that rolled through the county a few nights ago. School remains one of the few places where the routine of life continues almost unchanged. The path toward the building stretches across open farmland. The sun rises higher as you walk, casting long shadows that slowly shrink as the morning warms. A few wagons pass along the road, their wheels cutting narrow tracks through the dirt. Drivers raise their hands in greeting as they pass. Despite the difficult conditions of the decade, education remained a priority for many rural families. Government surveys conducted during the 1930s noted that most children in farming regions still attended school regularly whenever weather conditions allowed. Parents believed strongly that learning offered their children opportunities beyond the uncertain future of drought-stricken farms. The schoolhouse appears ahead, standing quietly beside the road with its familiar bell tower. When the bell rings, the children hurry inside, stamping dust from their shoes as they enter the classroom. The room looks much the same as before. Rows of wooden desks line the floor. A chalkboard fills the front wall. Tall windows allow morning light to spill across the room, though each sill carries a thin line of soil that's crept in through tiny cracks. The teacher arrives with a small stack of papers tucked beneath one arm. She begins the day with arithmetic. Numbers appear across the chalkboard as she writes careful equations in white chalk. Students open their books and begin working quietly, pencils scratching softly against paper. The calm atmosphere almost makes you forget about the dry fields outside. Yet the Dust Bowl still finds its way into the classroom in small ways. A curious detail mentioned in several rural diaries tells how teachers sometimes paused lessons during heavy dust days to sweep the floor or wipe the windowsills. Without constant cleaning, the dust could pile up so thickly that writing surfaces became difficult to use. You notice a broom resting near the doorway even now. The morning continues with reading practice. One student stands beside his desk and reads a passage about rivers and forests far from the plains. The description of flowing water seems almost magical compared with the dry landscape surrounding the school. The other children listen carefully. For many of them, such places exist only in books. Educational historians often discuss how classrooms during the Great Depression became places where children encountered ideas that stretched beyond the limits of their local environment. Geography lessons introduced distant mountains and oceans. History lessons described earlier generations who faced their own hardships. In subtle ways, these stories help students imagine futures larger than the farms where they lived. Outside the window, you notice the wind beginning to stir again. Dust lifts gently along the road, swirling in faint spirals, before drifting away across the fields. The teacher notices it as well. She closes the windows halfway to keep the worst of the dust outside, while the class continues working. At midday, the bell rings again for lunch. Children gather outside with small cloth bundles holding their meals. Most lunches are simple. Bread, preserved fruit, maybe a slice of cheese if the family has managed to keep a cow producing milk. You sit on the grass beside the schoolyard fence while the children eat. Despite the hardships of the decade, laughter still fills the yard. A group begins tossing a worn ball between them while others sit together trading small stories from home. One boy claims he saw a dust cloud so tall last week that it touched the sky. Another insists the wind nearly carried his hat into the next county. Whether those tales are exaggerated hardly matters. They reflect the strange world these children are growing up in. Researchers studying childhood during the Dust Bowl often explore how young people balance normal play with the responsibilities of farm life. Many students returned home each afternoon to chores that would occupy the rest of their day. Feeding animals, hauling water, helping parents maintain fields that might or might not produce a harvest. The afternoon lessons pass quietly as the teacher guides the class through writing exercises. Outside, the sky remains hazy, though the sun shines brightly through the thin layer of dust drifting high above the plains. When the final bell rings, the children gather their books and step outside once more. The wind has grown stronger again. Dust slides across the road in narrow moving ribbons as the group begins the walk home. You follow along, listening to their footsteps crunch softly against the dry ground. Ahead of you, the long road stretches towards scattered farmhouses resting beneath the vast sky. Another school day has ended. But beyond the schoolyard, the same challenges still wait across the plains. The land remains dry. The wind continues its restless wandering. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another dust storm may already be forming. Late afternoon drifts gently across the plains as you return from the road toward the farmhouse. The sun hangs lower now, glowing softly through a thin veil of dust that lingers high in the air. The light has a muted quality to it, as though the sky itself has grown tired. Your boots crunch over dry soil as you cross the yard. The windmill turns slowly above you, creaking with each steady rotation. Nearby, a few chickens wander lazily around the barn, scratching the ground in patient little circles. Life continues here with quiet determination. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen already carries the warm smell of supper being prepared. A pot simmers gently on the stove, while the woman moves about the room, measuring flour and stirring ingredients with careful rhythm. You step inside and brush dust from your coat. Even on calm days, a fine layer of soil seems to follow everyone indoors. Agricultural field reports from the middle years of the 1930s noted that dust infiltration inside rural homes became such a constant problem that many families kept brooms and cloths close at hand throughout the day. Floor shelves and window ledges often required cleaning several times before evening. You notice one such cloth folded beside the kitchen sink. The farmer enters a moment later carrying a small crate of eggs gathered from the hens. He places it carefully on the table and stretches his back after a long day of chores. Despite the harsh conditions surrounding them, farms like this one still operate with steady routines. Animals must be fed. Equipment must be maintained. Meals must be cooked. The woman cracks several eggs into a bowl while the farmer washes his hands at the sink. Outside the window, the fields stretch outward toward the horizon, their dry surface glowing softly under the fading sunlight. There was a time not long ago when those fields held tall rows of wheat. Now much of the soil lies exposed. One small but memorable detail preserved in personal journals from the Dust Bowl years describes how some families developed the habit of shaking tablecloths outside several times during meals. Even indoors, tiny grains of dust would sometimes settle onto dishes while people were eating. You glance at the table now and notice the cloth resting across its surface. Clean for the moment, the farmer sits down and begins repairing a worn piece of harness leather while supper finishes cooking. His hands move with practiced skill, threading the needle carefully through thick material. Quiet tasks like this help pass the evening hours. Researchers studying rural life during the Great Depression often explore how households relied on self-repair whenever possible. Buying new equipment could be difficult when money was scarce, so farmers frequently patched tools, clothing and machinery until the items could serve a few more seasons. Nothing is wasted if it can still be used. Outside the window, the wind stirs lightly again. Dust shifts across the yard in thin drifting ribbons. You listen to the faint rustle of soil moving along the ground. Some evenings remain calm like this. Others bring far stronger winds. Environmental historians sometimes discuss whether the severity of the Dust Bowl resulted primarily from drought alone or from decades of intensive farming that removed the natural grasses protecting the soil. The question continues to inspire careful research even today. Standing here on the farm, you can easily imagine how complex the problem must have been. The supper meal is finally ready. Plates are placed on the table while the farmer sets aside his tools. Steam rises from bowls of vegetables and fresh bread as everyone gathers around the lamplit table. For a while, the only sounds are the quiet clink of utensils and the gentle murmur of conversation. The food tastes simple but comforting. You notice the farmer occasionally glancing out the window while he eats, studying the colour of the sky as if searching for signs of tomorrow's weather. Farmers across the plains spent countless hours observing clouds and wind patterns during the 1930s. Without modern forecasting tools, careful observation often served as the best guide for predicting storms. The sky darkens gradually as evening settles across the land. After supper, the dishes are washed and stacked beside the sink. Lamps glow softly in the corners of the room, while the family settles into their usual evening rhythm. The farmer returns to his leather repair work. The woman mends a shirt near the lamp. You sit quietly nearby, listening to the peaceful sounds of the farmhouse. Outside, the prairie stretches wide beneath the growing night sky. Stars begin appearing one by one above the distant horizon. The wind has calmed again. For the moment, the air rests quietly across the land. Moments like this offer small comfort during a decade filled with uncertainty. Despite drought dust storms and economic hardship, homes like this one continue to glow warmly in the evening darkness. You lean back in the chair and watch the soft lamplight flicker across the wooden walls. Tomorrow will bring another day of work, another day of wind, another day of waiting to see what the land decides to give. But tonight the farmhouse stands calm and steady beneath the quiet plain sky. The next morning arrives with a pale grey light spreading slowly across the plains. You wake before the sun has fully cleared the horizon, sensing the quiet tension in the air that sometimes comes before the wind rises again. Outside the farmhouse, the land stretches wide and silent. A thin film of dust coats the porch rail, the steps, and even the metal handle of the water pump. It's the sort of fine powder that seems to appear overnight, settling gently across every surface. You step down into the yard and take a deep breath. The air feels cool, but it carries the faint dry taste that has become familiar to everyone living on the plains during these years. Nearby, the farmer is already walking toward the barn, his boots leaving small clouds of dust with each step. The animals must be cared for long before breakfast can begin. Farm routines rarely pause even during difficult seasons. Across the Great Plains, daily farm schedules remained remarkably consistent throughout the 1930s. Agricultural extension reports from the era describe how families maintained strict routines of feeding livestock, repairing equipment, and tending whatever crops still survived the harsh conditions. Consistency became a kind of stability in an uncertain world. You follow the farmer toward the barn, where the smell of hay and animals fills the air. A pair of horses shift patiently inside their stalls, while the farmer fills a trough with grain. Their coats carry a faint layer of dust as well. Out here, even the animals live inside the same drifting soil that blankets the land. Once the feeding is finished, you return towards the house, where breakfast is beginning to take shape in the kitchen. The smell of frying potatoes drifts through the open doorway, warm and inviting against the cool morning air. Inside the farmhouse, the woman moves steadily between stove and table. A kettle hums softly as water heats for coffee. You sit down while sunlight begins to filter through the window. Even the morning light looks slightly muted, softened by the thin dust floating high above the plains. Farm journals kept during the Dust Bowl period occasionally describe how sunlight sometimes appeared dim or copper-coloured during severe dust seasons. Tiny soil particles suspended in the atmosphere could alter the colour of the sky in surprising ways. You notice the effect even now as the sun climbs slowly higher. Breakfast is simple but filling. Bread, potatoes and strong coffee provide enough energy for the long hours of work waiting ahead. The farmer studies the sky through the kitchen window while he eats, paying careful attention to the direction of the wind. Weather determines nearly everything on a farm. Even small changes can affect how the day unfolds. A fascinating note preserved in one Oklahoma family diary describes how some farmers developed the habit of placing small pieces of cloth on fence posts to watch how the wind moved during the morning hours. The direction and strength of those little flags sometimes offered early clues about approaching dust storms. You glance outside and imagine similar bits of cloth fluttering along fence lines across the plains. Breakfast ends quickly. Soon everyone is moving again, stepping out into the brightening day. The farmer heads toward the shed to examine a piece of machinery that needs repair. The tractor sits half covered in dust, its metal frame dull beneath the morning sun. Farm equipment during the Great Depression often remained in service far longer than originally intended. With limited money available, farmers relied heavily on repairs and creative modifications to keep their machinery running. You watch as the farmer opens the engine compartment and studies the parts carefully. His hands move with quiet patience as he wipes away dust and checks the bolts holding the mechanism together. Tasks like this require time and concentration. Across the plains, thousands of farmers spent countless hours maintaining equipment that had become essential to their survival. Scholars who study environmental history often explore how the spread of mechanized farming in earlier decades may have unintentionally contributed to soil vulnerability during drought conditions. The issue remains a topic of thoughtful discussion among researchers examining the Dust Bowl era. Standing here beside the tractor, you can easily see how deeply technology had become part of farm life. The morning grows warmer as the sun climbs higher. Wind brushes lightly across the open fields, stirring thin wisps of dust along the ground. You walk toward the edge of the property where the land stretches wide and quiet beneath the sky. The fields look dry but peaceful at the moment. From this distance, the farmhouse appears small against the vast plains. Yet it stands firm. Homes like this one form the centre of life for countless families during the 1930s. Within their wooden walls, people cooked meals, told stories, mended clothes, and found moments of calm, despite the difficult world beyond their doors. You turn back towards the house where the farmer is still working patiently with the tractor. The day has only just begun. More chores will follow. More wind may come. But for now, the farm moves forward with the steady rhythm that has guided life on the plains for generations. By midday, the sun stands high above the plains, glowing through a pale sky that seems almost bleached of colour. You walk slowly along the edge of the fields, where the dry earth stretches outward in a quiet patchwork of faded soil and scattered weeds. The air is warmer now, though the breeze still carries the dusty scent of the land. From this distance, the farmhouse appears calm and steady, its wooden walls glowing softly beneath the sunlight. A thin column of smoke rises from the kitchen chimney, where the stove continues its steady work. Life here moves forward through simple routines. You notice the farmer kneeling near the edge of the field, examining the soil with careful attention. He scoops a handful into his palm and rubs it gently between his fingers. The grains crumble easily. Once, this same soil held enough moisture to support thick rows of wheat swaying in the summer wind. Now the ground feels loose and powdery, almost like flour. Agricultural survey reports produced during the mid-1930s documented how prolonged drought across the Great Plains drastically reduced soil moisture levels. Without steady rainfall, the exposed earth became vulnerable to the powerful winds that regularly swept across the region. Standing here, the reason becomes painfully clear. The farmer rises slowly and wipes his hands on his trousers before walking back toward the house. There is little that can be done with soil this dry except wait for rain. You follow him across the yard, where a small vegetable patch struggles quietly beside the fence. A few hardy plants push their leaves upward through the dusty ground, surviving on careful watering and stubborn determination. The woman stands nearby, holding a metal watering can. Each drop of water must be used carefully. Fresh water is precious during these years, especially in areas where wells run low after months without rain. Many families learn to stretch their supplies by collecting rainwater whenever possible and reusing household water for gardens. You watch as the woman pours a slow, steady stream onto the base of a tomato plant. The leaves perk slightly in response. A curious little detail mentioned in several Dust Bowl letters describes how some families reused leftover dishwater to keep small gardens alive. Even slightly soapy water could provide enough moisture to help plants survive another day in the dry soil. Every drop counted. After the watering is finished, you walk toward the barn, where the shade offers welcome relief from the midday sun. Inside the structure, the air smells of hay, leather, and warm wood. The horses stand quietly in their stalls, occasionally swishing their tails. Farm animals during the Dust Bowl years face the same difficult conditions as their owners. Lack of rain often meant reduced pasture growth, which forced farmers to rely more heavily on stored feed. Livestock management became a careful balancing act. Some ranchers were forced to sell animals they could no longer afford to feed, while others struggled to keep herds alive through increasingly dry seasons. You lean against a wooden post and listen to the gentle sounds of the barn. Outside, the wind begins to pick up slightly again. Dust lifts from the fields in thin, drifting lines, sliding across the ground like slow-moving shadows. Researchers studying the environmental history of the Great Plains frequently examine how the loss of native prairie grasses contributed to the severity of dust storms during this decade. These deep-rooted plants once helped anchor the soil firmly in place. Without them, the land became far more vulnerable to erosion. The farmer returns to the yard carrying a coil of rope and begins repairing a section of fence along the property line. His movements remain steady and patient despite the heat. Farm work often required long hours under open skies. Yet people developed ways to pace themselves through the day. You notice him pausing occasionally to wipe sweat from his forehead and glance toward the horizon, always watching for signs of changing weather. Clouds remain scarce today. Only a few thin streaks drift high above the plains. Still the farmer keeps watching. Many farmers, during the Dust Bowl years, became remarkably skilled at reading subtle weather clues. Slight shifts in wind direction or faint changes in cloud patterns could sometimes hint at approaching storms long before official forecasts were available. You walk toward the porch where the woman now sits mending a pair of worn work gloves. The shade beneath the roof feels cool compared with the open yard. She works quietly, with needle and thread reinforcing the fingers that have grown thin from months of heavy use. One fascinating note preserved in oral history interviews reveals that many rural families became experts at extending the life of everyday items during the Great Depression. Clothing tools and household goods were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. Practical creativity became an everyday skill. The afternoon continues slowly. Wind whispers across the plains. Dust drifts softly along the road. And the small farmhouse stands patiently against the wide, open land, holding together the quiet routines that carry life forward through difficult times. You settle into a chair on the porch and watch the shimmering horizon. Somewhere far away, a faint line of darker sky hints that the weather may yet change. But for now, the day remains calm. Late afternoon stretches quietly across the plains, and the light begins to soften as the sun slowly lowers toward the horizon. You find yourself walking along the dirt road that runs past the farmhouse, the same road that connects scattered homes across miles of open land. Your boots stir faint puffs of dust with each step. The road itself looks pale and dry, its surface worn smooth by wagon wheels, tractors and the steady travel of neighbours visiting one another during these difficult years. Despite the hardships of the decade, people across the Dust Bowl region rarely lived in complete isolation. Communities formed through small gatherings, shared labour and simple visits that helped families feel less alone beneath the vast sky. Ahead of you, another farmhouse appears in the distance. A wagon stands near the gate while two figures talk beside the fence. As you draw closer, you recognise the farmer from your own homestead, greeting a neighbour who has stopped by for a short visit. Neighbours played an essential role in rural life during the Great Depression. County Extension reports from the early 1930s describe how farming families frequently helped one another with repairs, equipment sharing, and advice about crops or livestock. When resources grew scarce, cooperation often became the difference between survival and failure. You approach quietly while the two men finish discussing the condition of the soil. The visitor removes his hat and wipes his brow before glancing toward the fields. "They're dry everywhere," he says softly. The farmer nods in agreement. Across much of the Great Plains, months without sufficient rainfall left farmland exposed and vulnerable. Crops struggled to grow, and the bare soil allowed powerful winds to lift entire layers of earth into the sky. You can almost feel the weight of that shared understanding between the two men. Still, the conversation soon turns lighter. They speak about equipment repairs, the price of feed in the nearest town, and rumours of rain that someone claimed to see forming far out west. One interesting detail preserved in several community histories describes how farmers during the Dust Bowl years often exchanged weather rumours almost like precious currency. A single report of dark clouds spotted hundreds of miles away could travel quickly through neighbouring farms. Hope sometimes arrived through simple conversation. The visitor soon climbs back onto his wagon and waves goodbye before continuing down the road. The creaking wheels fade slowly into the distance while the farmer watches for a moment. Life on the plains moves forward through these small encounters. You walk beside the farmer as he returns toward the house. The wind brushes lightly across the fields again, lifting thin streams of dust that drift along the ground like pale ribbons. Researchers studying rural communities during the Great Depression frequently examine how social networks helped families endure economic and environmental crises. Shared information, borrowed tools, and emotional support often strengthen the resilience of small farming regions. Even brief conversations at a fence line could matter. Back at the farmhouse, the porch offers welcome shade from the lingering heat of the afternoon. The woman sits there with a basket of vegetables gathered from the garden earlier in the day. She begins peeling potatoes while the farmer leans against the railing and gazes toward the horizon. The sky remains mostly clear. Only a few distant clouds appear far to the west, faint and thin against the wide blue sky. Yet farmers across the plains rarely stop watching the weather. Years of drought had trained people to observe every small change in the atmosphere. A fascinating observation recorded in several Dust Bowl memoirs tells how some families could recognize the approach of dust storms simply by listening to the sound of wind moving through distant fences or windmills. The tone of that wind sometimes carried subtle warnings before the dust clouds became visible. You listen carefully now. The windmill nearby creaks softly as it turns its metal blades, catching the breeze. For the moment, the sound remains calm and steady. Evening slowly approaches. The air cools as the sun sinks lower, casting long golden shadows across the yard. Chickens wander lazily near the barn while the horses stand quietly in their stalls. The rhythm of farm life settles into its evening pace once again. You help carry the basket of vegetables into the kitchen where supper preparations begin. The smell of onions soon fills the room while the stove warms the air. Inside these wooden walls, life continues with gentle persistence. Historians who study the Dust Bowl period often explore how families maintained everyday routines despite overwhelming challenges. Cooking meals, repairing tools, and visiting neighbours created a sense of stability that helped people endure uncertain times. Routine became its own quiet form of strength. As the sun finally dips below the horizon, the plains grow calm again. The sky turns deep orange and purple above the distant fields, and the wind softens to a quiet whisper across the land. You stand on the porch, watching the fading light. Tomorrow may bring more wind, or perhaps a hint of rain. But tonight, the farmhouse rests peacefully beneath the vast evening sky. Night passes quietly, and when morning returns, you notice something different in the air. The sky above the plains looks slightly thicker today, the sunlight filtered through a pale haze that stretches far across the horizon. You step outside onto the porch and rest your hands on the wooden railing. The windmill turns slowly as usual, but the breeze feels stronger than it did yesterday. Across the yard, the farmer is already studying the sky with careful attention. Farmers across the Great Plains spent countless mornings like this, scanning the horizon for subtle clues about the day ahead. Weather often decided whether the day would pass peacefully or bring another wave of dust rolling across the land. You walk out toward the fence where the fields lie open and exposed. From this vantage point, the land seems almost endless. Dry soil stretches toward the distant line where earth meets sky, broken only by scattered farmhouses and lonely windmills turning in the wind. A low gust slides across the ground, lifting a thin veil of dust that drifts slowly along the surface. The farmer squints toward the west. Meteorological records collected during the 1930s show that powerful winds frequently swept across the plain states during the spring months. When these winds moved across unprotected soil, they could lift enormous quantities of dust into the air within minutes. The early signs are often subtle: a slightly darker band along the horizon, a wind that grows steadily stronger. You notice both of those signs now. Far in the distance, a faint brown smudge hangs just above the earth, barely visible but slowly spreading wider. The farmer watches silently for a moment before turning toward the house. Inside, the woman is already preparing breakfast, unaware of what may be forming outside. The smell of coffee fills the kitchen while the stove crackles gently with heat. You step inside and brush dust from your sleeves. Even before the storm arrives, fine grains of soil seem to cling to everything. Breakfast is eaten a little more quickly this morning. Through the window, you see the wind strengthening across the fields. Small streams of dust now slide steadily along the ground like drifting smoke. By the time the dishes are cleared, the farmer is already moving through the house, closing windows. Storm preparations must happen early. Across the Dust Bowl region, families developed careful routines for protecting their homes when dust storms approached. Windows were shut tightly, cracks were covered with damp cloths, and extra water was sometimes placed indoors to help settle airborne dust. You help push a rolled cloth along the bottom edge of the door. Outside, the sky continues to darken. A strange copper-coloured light spreads across the land as the dust cloud grows larger on the horizon. One fascinating observation recorded in several first-hand accounts tells how approaching dust storms sometimes created an eerie silence before their arrival. Birds disappeared from the sky, and livestock grew restless as the wall of dust moved closer. You notice that silence now. Even the chickens have retreated near the barn. The wind rises sharply. Within minutes, the distant cloud transforms into a towering wall of swirling soil. It stretches upward like a moving mountain rolling across the plains with unstoppable momentum. You watch from the window as the storm approaches. The sky turns brown, daylight fades. Then the dust arrives. It strikes the farmhouse with a steady roar of wind and soil. The sound resembles a powerful river rushing against the wooden walls. Inside the house, the lamps are lit, even though it is still morning. The air grows dim and shadowy as dust blocks the sunlight outside. Scientific studies, conducted later in the 20th century, revealed that some dust bowl storms carried millions of tons of topsoil across hundreds of miles. In extreme cases, the dust travelled so far that it reached cities along the eastern coast of the United States. Standing inside this small farmhouse, you can feel the raw power of that moving earth. Fine dust slips through the smallest cracks despite every effort to seal the house. You taste grit on your tongue. The farmer sits quietly at the table while the storm rages outside. The woman places a damp cloth across the windowsill and wipes away the soil already gathering there. For a time there is little anyone can do except wait. Researchers who study the Dust Bowl period often examine how repeated exposure to these storms affected the emotional resilience of farming communities. Living under the constant threat of environmental disaster required enormous patience and determination. Inside the farmhouse, that quiet determination fills the room. The storm continues for nearly an hour. Then slowly the wind begins to weaken. The roar outside softens to a whisper. Light gradually returns through the windows as the dust cloud drifts farther east across the plains. You open the door cautiously and step outside. The yard looks transformed. Fresh layers of fine soil cover the porch, the fence, and even the leaves of the struggling garden plants. The horizon remains hazy, but the storm itself has moved on. You take a slow breath of the dusty air and glance back toward the farmhouse. Another storm has passed, and life on the plains continues. After the storm moves on, a strange quiet settles across the land. You step carefully down from the porch and into the yard, where the ground now carries a fresh blanket of loose soil. Each step sinks slightly into the powdery surface. The air smells faintly of earth. Above you, the sky slowly clears as the last drifting clouds of dust continue their long journey eastward. Storms like the one that just passed often left farms looking entirely changed. Fence lines disappeared beneath new layers of soil, wagon tracks vanished, and fields gained or lost inches of topsoil depending on the strength of the wind. You brush dust from your sleeves and look toward the barn. The farmer is already walking out to inspect the property. Work begins again almost immediately after every storm. Across much of the Great Plains County, agriculture agents reported that farmers spent countless hours after dust storms clearing soil from machinery, watering livestock, and checking buildings for damage. Even moderate storms could leave a surprising amount of work behind. You follow him toward the fence line. Along the edge of the field, small drifts of soil have gathered against the wooden posts like miniature dunes. The farmer studies them quietly, measuring the depth with the toe of his boot. Some of the soil that once covered this land has now travelled miles away. A curious little detail preserved in a Kansas farm journal describes how children sometimes treated fresh dust drifts almost like snowbanks sliding down the soft slopes or digging tunnels through the powdery earth. For young people, even these strange conditions occasionally became a source of play. You imagine those scenes while looking at the pale mounds gathered along the fence. The farmer begins brushing dust away from a section of wire where it has piled too high. If left untouched, these drifts can slowly bury parts of the fence. Small tasks like this appear everywhere after a storm. Nearby, the windmill creaks gently as the breeze returns to a calmer rhythm. The horses shift inside the barn, while the chickens cautiously emerge from their shelter. Animals seem to understand when the danger has passed. Back near the house, the woman steps onto the porch carrying a broom. She begins sweeping the layer of soil that collected along the wooden boards during the storm. Each stroke sends small clouds of dust drifting into the air. Life during the Dust Bowl required constant cleaning. Personal letters written during the 1930s frequently mention the endless battle against dust inside homes, barns and schools. Floors, furniture and clothing all needed regular attention. You help sweep the porch while the farmer continues inspecting the fields. The sun climbs higher in the sky, gradually warming the cool air left behind by the storm. From the edge of the yard, you can see how the wind reshaped the land overnight. Thin ridges run across the fields where soil gathered in gentle waves. Environmental researchers studying the Dust Bowl often examine how these storms redistributed topsoil across enormous distances. In some cases, soil removed from one farm could settle hundreds of miles away in entirely different regions. Standing here, it feels strange to imagine the ground itself travelling so far. The farmer returns to the house carrying a small clump of soil in his hand. He rubs it slowly between his fingers, watching how easily it breaks apart. Without moisture, the earth simply will not hold together. The woman finishes sweeping and rests the broom against the porch railing. Soon, the usual routines begin again. Lunch is prepared inside the kitchen while the farmer checks the water pump near the well. Storms sometimes clogged the mechanism with dust, making careful inspection necessary. You walk over and watch as he wipes the metal handle clean. Despite the difficult conditions, farms across the region continued operating through persistence and careful maintenance. One thoughtful question that researchers still explore today concerns how quickly farmers adapted their methods after repeated dust storms. Some evidence suggests that many began experimenting with new soil conservation techniques even before federal programs officially promoted them. Those early adjustments marked the beginning of important changes in agricultural practices. By midday, the yard begins to look more familiar again. The porch is clean, the fence line stands clear, and the drifting soil across the fields has settled into quiet stillness. You sit on the porch steps and look out across the wide plains. A faint haze still hangs along the distant horizon where the storm travelled onward, but the sky above the farmhouse has returned to a calm, pale blue. Storms may come again tomorrow or next week, but for now the land rests quietly beneath the sun, and life on the farm continues steady and patient beneath the endless sky of the Dust Bowl plains. Morning unfolds slowly after the previous day's storm. When you step outside the farmhouse, the air feels unusually still, as if the plains themselves are resting after the long struggle with wind and dust. A pale sun rises behind a thin veil of haze. Across the yard, the farmer stands beside the windmill, checking the pump that draws water from deep underground. His hands move carefully over the metal handle, brushing away the fine layer of soil that settled during the storm. Water is one of the most important treasures on a farm like this. You walk across the yard to join him. The pump groans softly as he pulls the handle down, and after a few steady strokes, a stream of cool water splashes into the waiting bucket. During the worst years of the Dust Bowl, many farms depended entirely on wells like this one. Records kept by regional agricultural offices during the early 1930s describe how groundwater sources became increasingly important as rainfall grew scarce across the plains. Without reliable wells, many farms simply could not survive. You dip your hand into the bucket. The water feels refreshingly cold compared with the dry air surrounding you. Nearby, the woman is already filling a second bucket to carry toward the vegetable patch. Each day, the small garden receives careful watering to help the fragile plants endure the heat. Across the plains, thousands of families relied on tiny home gardens to supplement their food supply during the Great Depression. Vegetables grown beside farmhouses often provided fresh nourishment when money for store-bought food was limited. You follow her toward the garden. The soil here is darker where water has soaked into the ground. A few rows of tomatoes, beans and onions push upward with stubborn determination. Every plant looks precious. A charming detail mentioned in several Dust Bowl letters tells how children were sometimes assigned the daily job of guarding garden plots from wandering chickens or hungry rabbits. Small fences and watchful eyes became part of the routine that protected these fragile crops. You imagine young children sitting nearby with sticks in hand, chasing away curious animals. Back near the barn, the farmer leads the horses out toward a patch of land where a little grass still grows. The animals move slowly, their hooves kicking up faint clouds of dust with each step. Livestock required careful attention during the drought years. Contemporary livestock reports from the region reveal that many farmers reduced the size of their herds because pasture land could no longer support large numbers of animals. Feeding fewer livestock often allowed families to conserve precious supplies of grain and hay. You lean against the fence and watch the horses lower their heads to nibble at the sparse grass. The windmill creaks quietly above you. For a while the farm feels peaceful again. The sky stretches wide and pale overhead while the wind drifts gently across the land. Yet even during calm mornings like this, the memory of storms remains close. Researchers who examine the environmental history of the Dust Bowl continue to explore how prolonged drought combined with earlier farming practices to create such severe conditions. Some studies emphasize the role of weather patterns, while others highlight the impact of widespread ploughing that removed native grasses. The discussion remains complex. Standing here, the land simply feels dry and fragile. You return toward the house where the smell of fresh bread drifts through the open door. Inside the kitchen table is already set for the midday meal. The woman places a loaf of warm bread onto the table and begins slicing it carefully. Food during these years often relied on simple ingredients that could be stretched across many meals. Bread, beans, and vegetables formed the backbone of daily cooking on many farms throughout the Depression. Still, the meal smells comforting. You sit down while the farmer washes his hands at the sink. Through the window, you notice a faint line of clouds gathering far on the horizon. They are thin and distant, but their presence immediately catches the farmer's attention. Farmers across the plains became skilled observers of even the smallest weather signs during the 1930s. A distant cloud formation sometimes offered the first hint of rain after weeks of dry skies. Whether those clouds will bring moisture remains uncertain. One thoughtful question that researchers often consider today involves how hope influenced decision-making on farms during the Dust Bowl years. Even a slight chance of rain could encourage farmers to plant small crops or continue caring for struggling fields. Hope and patience often worked side by side. After the meal, the farmer steps onto the porch and studies the horizon again. The clouds remain faint but steady. Perhaps they will grow larger by evening. Perhaps they will fade away like so many others. Either way, the farm continues its quiet rhythm. You sit beside him on the porch while the windmill turns slowly in the afternoon breeze. The plains stretch endlessly around you, and somewhere beyond that distant horizon the weather continues its long and unpredictable journey across the Dust Bowl land. The afternoon settles into a quiet warmth as the sun climbs higher over the plains. You sit for a while on the farmhouse porch, watching the wide land shimmer beneath the light. A soft wind moves across the fields, carrying faint streams of dust that slide gently over the ground. From here, the horizon looks almost endless. The farmer eventually stands and stretches his back before walking toward the barn. Another task waits there, one that has become increasingly common during these dry years. You follow him across the yard. Inside the barn, the air feels cooler, shaded by thick wooden walls, and the scent of hay stacked in the loft above. The horses stand calmly in their stalls while the farmer lifts a sack of feed onto the workbench. Feeding animals has become more complicated than it once was. During the height of the Dust Bowl, drought pasture grass often disappeared entirely across large parts of the plains. Agricultural bulletins distributed by federal farm agencies during the mid-1930s described how ranchers were forced to rely more heavily on stored feed and purchased grain to keep livestock alive. Some families simply could not afford enough feed. As a result, herds across the region grew smaller year by year. The farmer opens the sack and scoops a measured portion into a metal bucket. Every scoop is careful and deliberate. Nothing can be wasted. You notice the horses watching attentively as the grain is poured into their trough. They lower their heads and begin eating with steady patience. A curious habit mentioned in several oral histories from the Dust Bowl years describes how some farmers mixed unusual ingredients into animal feed when supplies ran low. In certain areas, chopped cactus or ground weeds were occasionally added to stretch limited grain reserves. Creative solutions often appeared during hard times. Once the feeding is finished, the farmer checks the barn roof, where small gaps sometimes allow dust to drift inside. He pushes a ladder against the wall and climbs up slowly to inspect the wooden beams. Dust storms could force soil into the smallest openings. You hold the ladder steady while he works above. Outside, the wind continues to whisper across the open land. The steady sound almost resembles distant waves moving across a quiet ocean. Environmental historians studying the Dust Bowl period often examine how farmers adapted their daily routines in response to repeated storms. Protecting buildings, storing feed, and adjusting planting schedules all became part of a new rhythm shaped by drought and wind. Life on the plains demanded flexibility. When the farmer climbs down from the ladder, both of you step back outside into the sunlight. The afternoon sky still holds a faint haze from earlier storms, but the air feels calm for now. Across the yard, the woman is hanging freshly washed clothes on a line stretched between two wooden posts. Each piece of fabric flutters gently in the breeze. Laundry during the Dust Bowl years often required careful timing. If a dust storm arrived unexpectedly, clean clothing could quickly become coated in soil before it had time to dry. One small but memorable story preserved in a Nebraska family letter tells of a woman who washed the same shirts 3 times in one day after sudden dust gusts repeatedly covered them before they could dry on the line. You imagine the frustration behind that moment, yet the woman hanging laundry today works with quiet patience. She pins each shirt carefully while watching the sky out of the corner of her eye. Storm awareness becomes second nature here. You walk toward the vegetable patch where the morning watering has helped the plants stand a little taller. The soil still looks dry beyond the small garden, but within the fence, the leaves show faint signs of life. A breeze moves through the rows of tomatoes. Nearby, the windmill turns with its familiar slow creaking sound. Meteorological observations from the Dust Bowl era reveal that even modest wind speeds could lift dry topsoil when vegetation cover was thin. What might seem like a gentle breeze in other regions sometimes carried soil across the plains during these years. You glance across the open fields and see faint streaks of dust sliding along the ground again. For now, they remain small. As evening slowly approaches, long shadows begin stretching across the yard. The farmer returns to the porch where he sits quietly for a moment, watching the sky change colours. The woman gathers the dried laundry from the line. Inside the house, supper preparations will soon begin. Life continues with its steady rhythm of chores, meals, and quiet observation of the land. Researchers who study the human side of the Dust Bowl often reflect on how resilience grew from these simple routines. Small acts of care for animals, gardens, and homes helped families endure conditions that often seemed overwhelming. You sit on the porch steps beside the farmer and look out over the fields once more. The land remains dry. The wind continues to wander across the plains. Yet the farmhouse stands firm beneath the fading light of the day. And as the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, another quiet evening prepares to settle over the Dust Bowl countryside. Evening deepens across the plains as the sun slips quietly below the horizon. A warm orange glow lingers for a few moments along the distant fields before fading into a soft purple twilight. You sit on the farmhouse porch watching the last light stretch across the land. The windmill turns slowly against the darkening sky. Its steady creak feels almost like a heartbeat for the farm. Inside the house, the woman lights the kerosene lamps, and gentle golden light begins to glow through the windows. Supper is nearly ready, and the smell of simmering vegetables drifts into the cool evening air. You step inside where the wooden kitchen feels warm and welcoming after the long day of chores. The farmer sits at the table wiping dust from his hands with a cloth. Even after hours indoors, a faint layer of soil still seems to find its way onto every surface. Dust never fully leaves this place. Historical weather observations recorded during the Dust Bowl decade reveal that some regions of the Great Plains experienced hundreds of dust-filled days between 1930 and 1936. Even when full storms were not present, loose soil often remained suspended in the air. The evidence of that drifting dust surrounds you everywhere. The table is set with simple dishes, bowls of beans, slices of fresh bread, a small plate of vegetables from the garden. Meals during the Great Depression often relied on foods that could be grown locally or stored easily through difficult seasons. Families learned to prepare nourishing dishes from limited ingredients. You sit down while the farmer pours coffee into a pair of tin cups. Outside, the last traces of daylight disappear completely. Night settles gently across the plains. One small detail remembered in several Dust Bowl memoirs describes how many families developed the habit of shaking their clothing before entering the house each evening. Even after ordinary outdoor chores, pockets and cuffs often collected surprising amounts of dust during the day. You notice the farmer doing exactly that as he hangs his coat near the door. Supper passes quietly. Conversation drifts between small topics: the condition of the fence, the clouds that appeared briefly in the afternoon, the possibility that rain might eventually return to the land. Even small hints of weather change remain important. Researchers who examine rural communities during the Depression frequently consider how hope played a role in sustaining farm families through long periods of hardship. The possibility of rain or better harvests often remained part of daily conversation, even when drought continued month after month. After the dishes are cleared, the farmer reaches for the small radio resting on a shelf near the wall. He adjusts the dial carefully. Soon, a faint signal fills the room with soft music and distant voices. Radio broadcasts during the 1930s connected remote farms with the outside world in ways that earlier generations could hardly imagine. News from cities, weather reports, even entertainment programs that travelled hundreds of miles through the air. You sit back in a wooden chair and listen as the announcer reads the evening news. Across the country, the Great Depression continues to shape daily life. Banks struggle, businesses close, and millions of people search for steady work. Yet out here on the plains, the challenges feel both familiar and uniquely tied to the land itself. A fascinating note found in several rural radio station archives reveals that some broadcasters in Dust Bowl states began including soil conservation advice in their farm programs. Tips about planting windbreak trees or protecting fields from erosion slowly reached listeners across the region. New ideas travelled along those radio waves. Whether every farmer trusted those suggestions right away remains an interesting question. Some historians believe many farmers welcomed new conservation methods, while others suspect that change happened slowly as traditions adapted over time. Inside the farmhouse, the radio music continues softly. Outside, the night sky stretches wide and full of stars. Without city lights, nearby the stars appear bright and countless above the open plains. The Milky Way forms a pale river of light crossing the darkness overhead. You step onto the porch again and breathe the cool night air. The land feels peaceful at this hour. The wind has calmed to a gentle whisper. Even the drifting dust seems to rest for a while beneath the quiet sky. Back inside, the lamps glow warmly against the wooden walls, while the farmer finishes listening to the final radio program of the evening. Soon the house will grow silent. Another day will end here on the Dust Bowl plains. And tomorrow, when the sun rises again, the wind, the soil, and the steady work of farm life will begin once more. The night passes quietly, and when the first light of dawn spreads across the plains, you wake to a world that feels unusually still. The air outside the farmhouse carries a faint coolness, and the sky glows pale blue above the wide horizon. You step onto the porch and pause for a moment. The windmill stands almost motionless this morning, its metal blades barely turning. For once, the wind has chosen to rest. Moments like this feel rare on the Dust Bowl plains. Across the yard, the farmer emerges from the barn, carrying a small lantern that he used during the early chores. He sets it down beside the porch steps and glances toward the eastern sky, where the sun is slowly climbing. The land stretches wide and quiet in every direction. On mornings without strong wind, the dust that normally drifts through the air settles gently back onto the ground. You can see the thin coating of soil covering the fence rails, the wagon wheels, and even the leaves of the small garden near the house. Weather observers who kept daily logs across the plains during the 1930s frequently noted these calmer intervals between storms. Even during the worst drought years, quiet mornings sometimes followed nights when the wind finally slowed. You walk toward the garden where the woman is already examining the plants. The tomatoes and beans look slightly stronger after yesterday's watering. Drops of moisture still cling to the dark soil around their roots. She kneels down and gently presses the earth around one of the stems. Growing vegetables in this climate requires careful attention. Home gardens became important sources of fresh food for many farm families during the Great Depression. Agricultural extension pamphlets distributed during the decade encouraged households to grow small plots whenever possible, even in dry regions. You help carry another bucket of water from the pump. Each plant receives a slow and steady pour. One charming recollection, preserved in an Oklahoma oral history, tells of children naming the individual tomato plants in their family garden, treating them almost like pets, because so much effort went into keeping them alive through the drought. You smile at the thought while watching the leaves sway gently in the light breeze. After the watering is finished, the farmer invites you to walk with him toward the far edge of the property. A narrow path leads through the fields where the soil remains dry and cracked beneath your boots. Even after recent storms, the land still shows the long effects of drought. Agricultural soil surveys completed during the Dust Bowl years documented how repeated wind erosion removed layers of fertile topsoil from countless farms across the region. In some areas, several inches of valuable soil simply disappeared into the air over the course of a few seasons. Standing here, you can imagine how devastating that loss must have been. The farmer kneels beside a patch of ground and lifts a small clump of dirt. It crumbles almost immediately in his hand. Without moisture and plant roots to hold it together, the soil behaves more like powder than earth. Researchers studying the Dust Bowl continue examining the balance between natural drought cycles and human agricultural practices in shaping the disaster. Some studies highlight the role of severe weather patterns, while others emphasize how widespread ploughing had removed the deep-rooted prairie grasses that once protected the soil. The full story remains complex. You rise and continue walking along the fence line, where the land slopes gently downward toward a dry creek bed. During the wetter years, this creek once carried water through the farm after heavy rains. Now it lies mostly empty, its banks lined with brittle grass. The farmer pauses there for a moment. Waterways like this one played an important role in shaping the landscape of the Great Plains. Historical land surveys from earlier decades describe seasonal streams that helped irrigate fields and replenish groundwater supplies. During the Dust Bowl years, many of those small creeks dried up entirely. You sit on a flat stone beside the creek bed and watch a small bird hop along the cracked soil. Life still finds ways to survive here. A light wind begins to stir again. As the morning progresses, dust lifts softly along the far fields, though nothing like the violent storms that sometimes sweep across the region. Back at the farmhouse, the woman waves from the porch to signal that breakfast is ready. You and the farmer begin the slow walk back across the property. The farmhouse grows larger with every step, its familiar shape standing against the brightening sky. Smoke curls gently from the chimney where the stove warms the kitchen. Inside the table waits with fresh bread and coffee. Another day on the Dust Bowl plains has begun. And for now, the calm morning offers a brief and welcome pause in the long struggle between wind soil and the people who continue to call this land home. The morning grows brighter as the sun climbs higher above the plains. After breakfast, you step outside once more, feeling the warmth slowly return into the land. The calm air that greeted you earlier begins to stir again, carrying faint whispers of wind across the open fields. The farmer stands beside the old pickup truck parked near the barn. It is not a new machine by any stretch. The paint has faded and dust rests in every seam of the metal. Still, the engine remains reliable, which makes it a valuable tool on a farm where distance matters. He gestures towards the passenger seat. Today you are heading into town. The truck rattles gently as it rolls along the narrow dirt road that cuts through the countryside. Fields stretch wide on both sides, many of them lying fallow after seasons of poor harvests. Agricultural reports collected by federal agencies during the 1930s describe how large portions of farmland across the Great Plains were left unplanted during the worst Dust Bowl years. With topsoil blowing away and rainfall remaining scarce, many farmers simply could not risk another crop failure. The road curves slowly toward a cluster of buildings on the horizon. That is the town. Small towns like this form the backbone of rural life during the Depression. They served as places where farmers purchased supplies, exchanged news, and occasionally enjoyed small moments of community. As you approach, you begin to see the familiar structures. A general store with wooden steps leading up to the door. A small post office beside it. A gas pump standing proudly in front of a weathered garage. The truck pulls to a stop near the general store, and you climb down onto the dusty street. The town feels quiet this morning, though a few people move slowly between the buildings. A man tips his hat as he walks past, and another farmer stands near the store entrance talking with the shopkeeper. You step inside the general store. Wooden shelves line the walls, filled with sacks of flour, canned goods, tools and small household items. The smell of coffee beans mixes with the scent of leather and wood. General stores played a crucial role in rural economies during the Great Depression. Many allowed trusted customers to purchase items on credit when cash was scarce, recording purchases carefully in small ledgers kept behind the counter. The shopkeeper greets the farmer warmly. They begin discussing the condition of the roads and the rumours of rain that might arrive later in the week. Weather remains the most common topic of conversation here. You wander slowly through the store while they talk. One amusing memory preserved in a Kansas community archive recalls how some general stores kept a jar of penny candy near the counter, specifically to cheer up children who accompanied their parents during difficult financial times. Even when money was tight, a single piece of candy could feel like a small celebration. You notice a similar jar sitting quietly beside the register. After gathering a few supplies, the farmer walks across the street toward the post office. Inside, a small line of people waits patiently. Letters hold special meaning in places like this. With neighbours often living miles apart, written messages become an important way of sharing news and maintaining friendships. Postal records from the 1930s show that rural mail routes continued operating across vast areas of the country even during the worst years of the Depression. Mail carriers often travelled long distances each day to deliver letters and newspapers to isolated farmsteads. You watch as the postmaster sorts envelopes into wooden slots behind the counter. The farmer receives a small stack of letters tied with twine. Outside again, the wind has picked up slightly. Dust rolls gently along the edges of the street as you walk back toward the truck. Nearby, two men stand beside the garage, discussing a recent government program that encourages farmers to plant rows of trees as windbreaks. These shelter belts are designed to slow the wind and protect soil from blowing away. Conservation programs like this became increasingly important during the Dust Bowl era. Federal initiatives encouraged farmers to adopt new methods aimed at preserving the land for future generations. Not everyone agreed immediately on the best solutions. Modern environmental historians continue examining how quickly these conservation practices spread across the plains. Some evidence suggests that many farmers embraced the programs with relief, while other accounts indicate that a number of communities approached them cautiously at first. The truck engine starts again with a familiar rumble. As you leave town, the buildings slowly shrink behind you until they become small shapes against the wide horizon. The road stretches ahead through open country once more. Despite the hardships surrounding this land, life continues moving forward in steady rhythms of work travel and quiet determination. And as the truck rolls along the dusty road toward the waiting farmhouse, the wind carries with it the soft promise of another long afternoon on the plains. The truck rolls steadily back along the country road as the late morning sun brightens the wide plains. Dust lifts softly behind the tyres, forming a pale trail that slowly fades into the still air. You rest your arm against the window frame while the farmer guides the vehicle along the familiar path toward home. The land stretches quietly on either side, broken only by fences, windmills, and the occasional distant farmhouse. Life here often unfolds in long stretches of open space. As you approach the farm again, the barn roof appears first above the gentle rise of the field. The farmhouse follows, standing sturdy against the endless sky. The farmer parks the truck beside the barn and shuts off the engine. For a moment, everything grows silent except for the faint creaking of the windmill turning overhead. You step down onto the ground. The afternoon work is about to begin. Inside the barn, the air smells of hay and dry wood. Sunlight filters through narrow gaps in the walls, creating bright beams that cut through the dim interior. The animals shift softly in their stalls. Caring for livestock remained one of the most reliable parts of farm life during the 1930s. While crop harvests often failed during the Dust Bowl years, many families depended on chickens, cows and pigs to provide steady food and small sources of income. You carry a bucket of feed while the farmer checks the water troughs. The animals gather quietly as grain is poured into the feeding bins. Their movements create soft rustling sounds that echo gently through the barn. One small detail remembered in family recollections from the plains describes how farmers sometimes named their cows after weather conditions. A stubborn animal might be called Dusty, while a calmer one might earn the name Cloud or Rain. It's a small touch of humour in a place where the weather dominates nearly every part of life. After the feeding is finished, you walk outside again into the bright afternoon light. The wind has begun to strengthen slightly. You can see small clouds of dust forming in the distant fields where the soil lies loose and dry. The farmer studies the horizon carefully. Records kept by regional weather stations during the 1930s show that wind speeds across the plains frequently increased during the afternoon hours. Warm air rising from the heated ground often created stronger gusts later in the day. Those winds sometimes remained harmless. Other times they carried enormous walls of dust across the land. Today the breeze seems manageable, though the farmer continues watching the sky with quiet attention. You follow him toward the fence line where a section of wire needs tightening. Repairing fences is a constant task on farms like this. Strong winds, wandering livestock and shifting soil often damage the wooden posts that hold the wire in place. The farmer hands you a pair of pliers. Together you pull the wire tight and secure it around the post. Sweat gathers on your forehead under the afternoon sun. Even simple repairs take effort when the dry soil resists every step. Nearby, a line of young trees stands along the edge of the field. Their leaves flutter softly in the breeze. These trees were planted only a few years ago as part of a windbreak effort designed to slow the movement of air across the farmland. Shelter belts like these eventually stretched across thousands of miles throughout the Great Plains. Government conservation programs during the Dust Bowl encouraged the planting of millions of trees to protect fields from erosion. Rows of hardy species such as elm and cottonwood helped reduce wind speed near the ground. Whether these shelter belts alone could fully prevent soil loss has remained a topic of discussion among environmental researchers. Some studies suggest they made a meaningful difference, while others point out that broader changes in farming methods also played a vital role. You stand for a moment beneath the young trees. Their shade feels cool compared with the open field. Leaves whisper gently above your head as the breeze passes through the branches. The farmer seems quietly proud of them. Planting trees in a place once covered mostly by grass required patience and careful watering. Each sapling represented a small investment in the future of the farm. After finishing the fence repairs, you both walk slowly back toward the house. The afternoon sun begins its slow journey downward, casting longer shadows across the yard. Inside the farmhouse, the woman prepares the evening meal and the familiar scent of cooking drifts through the open window. Another day of work has nearly passed. The plains remain vast and unpredictable, yet the steady routines of farm life continue to anchor each passing hour. And as the wind moves softly across the fields, the land waits quietly for whatever tomorrow might bring. The afternoon light begins to soften as the sun slowly lowers across the plains. Shadows stretch longer across the fields, and the air carries a faint warmth that signals the final hours of daylight. You sit for a moment on the porch steps, brushing dust from your boots after the fence repairs. The land before you looks calm now, though the wind continues its quiet wandering across the open ground. Out here, the rhythm of the day follows the sun. Morning work begins early, and by late afternoon, most tasks move at a slower pace. Across the yard, the farmer walks toward the barn once more. A few final chores remain before evening settles in. You follow him across the packed dirt path. Inside the barn, the animals greet you with soft movements and low sounds. The cows shift in their stalls while the chickens scratch gently at the straw scattered along the floor. Caring for animals twice each day remained a steady routine on most farms throughout the 1930s. Farm diaries kept during the Dust Bowl years often describe these predictable chores as small anchors of normal life during a time when crops and weather could not always be trusted. The farmer lifts a metal pail and begins preparing the evening milking. You sit nearby on a wooden crate, listening to the quiet rhythm that fills the barn. The steady sound of milk hitting the bottom of the bucket echoes softly in the dim space. Outside, the wind brushes against the barn walls in slow passing waves. A curious memory preserved in an oral history from western Kansas recalls that some farm children tried placing small cloth covers over milk buckets during dusty afternoons to keep stray soil from drifting inside. Even simple farm tasks required creative adjustments when dust storms were common. You can imagine the farmer doing the same thing on difficult days. After the milking is finished, the animals settle again into a peaceful stillness. The farmer carries the pail carefully toward the farmhouse while you close the barn door behind him. The sky above the fields has begun to change colour. Pale gold spreads along the horizon while the upper sky fades towards soft blue. It's the kind of evening that feels quiet and almost gentle. You walk toward the garden to check the plants one more time. The tomatoes appear stronger today, their leaves standing tall in the fading light. A few small green fruits have begun forming along the stems. Extension Service pamphlets circulated during the Great Depression frequently encouraged farm families to maintain kitchen gardens like this one. These small plots helped supplement diets with fresh vegetables when store-bought food became too expensive. You kneel beside the soil and run your fingers gently across the dry surface. Even here, careful watering has kept the ground slightly darker than the surrounding fields. Some agricultural historians examining the period have explored how household gardens quietly improved food security for many rural families during the worst years of economic hardship. Though rarely large enough to supply everything, these gardens often provided crucial nutrition. The woman steps onto the porch and waves to you. Supper is nearly ready. You walk back toward the house while the sun dips lower behind the distant horizon. The light grows softer with each passing minute, bathing the fields in warm shades of amber and orange. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen glows with lamplight. The smell of stew fills the room. Dinner tonight includes beans, potatoes, and a few slices of fresh bread baked earlier in the day. Meals like this were common on farms throughout the Great Plains during the Depression. Many families relied on simple dishes made from ingredients that could be stored easily or grown close to home. You sit at the table with the farmer and his wife as the evening quiet settles around the house. Outside, the windmill creaks slowly as the breeze returns. Between bites of food, the farmer mentions that a neighbour plans to leave the region soon. Another family preparing to move west in search of better farmland. Migration from the Dust Bowl states increased sharply during the 1930s as drought and financial hardship pushed many residents to seek new opportunities elsewhere. California became one of the most common destinations for those travelling west along long highways. Whether every family who left truly found better conditions remains a question that historians continue exploring. Some accounts describe new opportunities and improved harvests, while others tell of continued struggle in unfamiliar places. The conversation fades as the meal ends. You help carry the dishes to the sink, while night slowly settles across the plains outside the windows. Another long day on the Dust Bowl farm draws gently to a close. The wind whispers softly through the fields, and the quiet land prepares itself for the cool stillness of evening. Night slowly settles over the plains after supper. The last glow of sunlight fades beyond the horizon, leaving the wide sky filled with deepening shades of blue and violet. You step outside the farmhouse and pause on the porch. The air has cooled since the afternoon, and a gentle breeze moves across the fields. The land that seemed harsh and dusty during the day now feels quiet and almost peaceful. Above you, the first stars begin to appear. Out here, far from large towns and electric lights, the night sky spreads with remarkable clarity. Constellations stretch across the darkness like bright maps drawn in silver. Farm families, during the 1930s, often spent evenings outdoors like this when the weather allowed. With limited electricity in many rural homes, the cool night air offered a comfortable place to rest and talk after the day's work was finished. The farmer leans against the porch railing beside you. He studies the sky with the calm familiarity of someone who has spent a lifetime watching the weather. Across the yard, the windmill turns slowly, its metal blades reflecting faint starlight with each rotation. Even small changes in wind direction could matter greatly during the Dust Bowl years. Weather observations kept by regional stations reveal that shifting winds sometimes carry dust storms hundreds of miles across several states. Tonight, however, the air remains calm. You hear the distant chirping of insects rising from the fields. Their steady rhythm forms a quiet background to the evening. The woman soon joins you on the porch, carrying 3 tin cups filled with warm tea. Simple drinks like this often ended the day on farms across the plains. Tea, coffee, or sometimes warm milk provided a small moment of comfort before bedtime. You sit together beneath the open sky, a small but memorable detail preserved in family recollections from the region tells how some children during the Dust Bowl years learned to judge the next day's weather by watching the colour of the sunset. A deep red glow sometimes signalled dry winds ahead, while softer golden evenings brought cautious hope for calmer conditions. Whether those predictions always worked is uncertain, but the habit remained part of local folklore. The farmer points toward a faint band of clouds forming low on the horizon. Rain remains the most important thing people here hope to see. Meteorological records, compiled during the early 1930s, show that rainfall across parts of the Great Plains dropped far below normal levels for several consecutive years. These extended drought conditions created the dry soil that allowed powerful dust storms to form. Understanding exactly why the drought lasted so long has been the subject of ongoing research among climate scientists. Some studies connect the event to natural ocean temperature cycles, while others suggest that complex atmospheric patterns may have intensified the dry conditions over the central United States. The night air grows cooler as the hours pass. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself while listening to the wind brush gently across the grass. The quiet stretches comfortably. Eventually the farmer stands and stretches his back after the long day's work. It is time to turn in for the night. Inside the farmhouse, the soft glow of a kerosene lamp lights the hallway. The wooden floors creak faintly beneath your steps as you move towards the small bedroom prepared for guests. Many rural homes during the Great Depression relied on kerosene lamps like this for lighting. While electrical service was expanding across parts of the country, numerous farms still depended on simpler methods to brighten their evenings. You place the lamp on a small bedside table. The window beside the bed stands slightly open, allowing the cool prairie air to drift into the room. From here you can hear the windmill turning slowly outside. Its steady creaking becomes part of the nighttime soundscape that surrounds the farmhouse. Before lying down, you glance once more through the window. The stars remain bright across the sky, scattered above the dark fields that stretch endlessly beyond the yard. Despite the hardships faced by the people living here, the land still offers moments of calm like this one. You climb into bed and pull the blanket up to your shoulders. Outside, the wind continues its quiet wandering across the plains, and the farmhouse settles into the deep stillness of night. Another day in Dust Bowl, America has gently come to rest. Morning arrives quietly across the plains. At first, the change is so subtle that you barely notice it. The sky outside the bedroom window slowly shifts from deep blue to a faint grey glow that spreads along the horizon. You wake to the soft creaking of the windmill turning in the early breeze. For a moment you remain under the blanket listening. The farmhouse is still mostly silent. Somewhere down the hallway you hear a floorboard gently creak as the farmer begins moving through the house to start the day. Life on a Dust Bowl farm rarely allows for sleeping late. You sit up and glance through the window. The first thin streaks of sunlight are just beginning to appear above the distant fields. The land looks calm, though a faint haze of dust lingers low across the ground. Weather observers working across the Great Plains during the 1930s often recorded early morning dust haze on calm days following strong winds. Fine soil particles could remain suspended in the air long after a storm had passed. You dress and step into the hallway. The kitchen already glows with the warm light of a kerosene lamp. The farmer sits at the table with a cup of coffee while studying a folded newspaper that arrived in yesterday's mail. Newspapers played an important role in keeping rural communities informed during the Great Depression. Even in isolated areas, families relied on daily or weekly papers to follow national events, weather forecasts and government announcements. You pour yourself a cup of coffee and sit down beside him. The headline on the front page mentions new relief programs designed to support struggling farmers across the country. Government efforts to address the agricultural crisis expanded steadily throughout the 1930s. Among the most notable initiatives were soil conservation programs and financial assistance aimed at helping farmers rebuild damaged land. How effective these policies ultimately proved has been examined by many historians. Some research suggests that federal programs helped stabilize farming communities, while other scholars emphasize that recovery also depended heavily on changing weather patterns later in the decade. Outside, the first true sunlight spills across the fields. You finish your coffee and step onto the porch once more. The morning air feels cool against your face. A few clouds drift slowly across the pale sky, while the wind begins its daily movement across the plains. Across the yard, the woman is already gathering eggs from the chicken coop. You walk over to help her. The chickens scatter lightly as the coop door opens, clucking softly, while she reaches beneath the wooden nesting boxes. Soon several brown eggs rest in the basket she carries. Eggs remained one of the most reliable food sources for farm families during the Dust Bowl years. Chickens required relatively little feed compared with larger livestock, making them practical animals to maintain even during difficult seasons. A delightful story preserved in a family memoir from Oklahoma tells of a rooster that learned to perch on the porch railing every morning and crow directly at the kitchen window until someone came outside with feed. The bird apparently considered itself responsible for announcing the start of the workday. You imagine such a creature strutting proudly across this very yard. With the eggs collected, the woman returns to the house while you follow the farmer toward the barn. Inside, the animals greet the morning with quiet movement. The cows shift their weight while the horses stamp gently against the wooden floor. You help carry fresh water into the troughs. Each chore unfolds with calm familiarity. The steady routines of feeding, watering and cleaning have been repeated here every day for years. The farmer opens the large barn doors wide, allowing sunlight to stream inside. Dust motes drift through the beams of light floating slowly in the still air. You step outside again once the chores are finished. The fields stretch wide before you, their surface marked by the faint lines of earlier ploughing and the scattered growth of hardy grasses trying to reclaim the soil. Agricultural researchers studying the Dust Bowl period often discuss how quickly native grasses could return to abandoned fields when farming stopped. These plants possessed deep root systems that once protected the soil of the Great Plains before widespread cultivation began. Restoring that balance between farming and natural vegetation became an important lesson learned from the environmental disaster. The farmer rests his arms on the fence rail beside you. Together, you watch the morning unfold across the land. The wind grows a little stronger as the sun climbs higher, carrying faint trails of dust across the distant fields. Yet the day still feels calm compared with the violent storms that sometimes sweep through this region. Another long day of work lies ahead, but for now, in this quiet moment of early morning, the plains seem almost peaceful as the farmhouse begins its steady rhythm once again. The morning continues unfolding slowly across the plains. After the early chores are finished, you find yourself standing once again near the fence line with the farmer. The sun has climbed higher now, brightening the wide landscape that stretches beyond the fields. From here, you can see miles of open land. Farms appear here and there along the horizon, each marked by a small cluster of buildings and a turning windmill. The distances between neighbours are large, which makes visits rare and often planned in advance. Yet community still finds ways to exist in places like this. The farmer gestures toward a dirt road that disappears over a distant hill. Later today, he explains, several neighbours will gather at a nearby farm to help repair a damaged barn roof. You nod with interest. Mutual aid became an essential part of rural life. During the difficult years of the Great Depression, families frequently helped one another with harvest repairs and building projects, especially when hiring paid workers was no longer possible. This informal cooperation helped many farms survive when resources were scarce. You begin the walk toward the neighbouring property shortly after mid-morning. The farmer loads a few tools into the back of the truck, and soon you are travelling once again along the familiar dusty road. The journey takes only a short while. When you arrive, a small group of men already stands beside the barn, studying the damage left by a recent windstorm. A section of wooden boards near the roof has loosened, allowing dust and rain to slip inside. Everyone greets each other with quiet friendliness. There is no long ceremony. Work begins almost immediately. Ladders are lifted into place. Hammers appear from toolboxes and fresh boards are carried toward the structure. You climb partway up the ladder to help pass materials to the farmer while he secures the wood along the upper beams. Barns like this one served as vital centres of activity on farms throughout the plains. Agricultural surveys conducted during the 1930s describe how these sturdy buildings protected livestock stored feed and sheltered equipment from harsh weather. Without a reliable barn, daily farm operations became much more difficult. As the work continues, conversation drifts easily between the men on the ground and those higher on the ladder. They talk about the condition of the crops, rumours of rain moving through neighbouring states, and the latest news heard in town. One neighbour tells a story about his grandfather who once claimed he could smell approaching dust storms before they appeared on the horizon. According to family law, the old man insisted that the air carried a faint, earthy scent just before the winds began to rise. Whether that sense truly worked remains uncertain, but the tale brings quiet laughter from the group. You wipe sweat from your forehead as the sun grows warmer. Working together like this creates a steady rhythm. Boards are lifted, nails hammered, and sections of roof slowly return to their proper place. Observations recorded by rural sociologists studying Depression-era farming communities often highlight how gatherings like these strengthen social bonds between neighbours. Even during years of hardship, shared labour offered moments of connection and mutual support. After several hours of effort, the final board is secured. The barn roof stands whole once again. Everyone climbs down from the ladders and steps back to admire the work. Dust clings to clothing and boots, but the feeling of accomplishment spreads quietly through the group. The owner of the barn thanks everyone and invites the helpers to sit beneath a nearby shade tree. Soon, jars of cold water and simple sandwiches appear from the farmhouse kitchen. You settle onto the grass beside the others. Conversations continue in relaxed tones while the afternoon breeze rustles the leaves overhead. The shade provides welcome relief from the growing heat. Some agricultural historians exploring life during the Dust Bowl period have noted that these cooperative gatherings helped maintain morale in rural areas, while the environment and economy often brought discouraging news. Moments of shared effort reminded people that they were not facing the challenges alone. The farmer beside you nods quietly as another neighbour describes plans to plant additional rows of trees along his property next spring. Shelter belts remain an important topic of discussion throughout the region. The idea of using trees to slow the wind continues spreading from farm to farm. Eventually, the small gathering begins to break apart. Tools are packed away, hands are shaken, and neighbours climb into their trucks to return home. The sun has begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. You ride back with the farmer along the dusty road once more. The repaired barn grows smaller behind you, while the familiar outline of the farmhouse appears ahead. Another day of steady work and quiet cooperation has passed across the plains. And as the truck rolls toward home beneath the wide afternoon sky, the land seems to breathe a little easier, knowing that its people continue facing each challenge together. By the time you return from helping repair the neighbour's barn, the afternoon has begun to soften into evening. The truck rolls slowly into the farmyard, its tyres crunching over dry gravel, before coming to a gentle stop beside the house. You climb down and stretch your arms. The day's work has left a comfortable tiredness in your muscles, the kind that comes from honest effort rather than hurry. Across the fields, the light has taken on that warm golden tone that often arrives before sunset. The sky seems wider at this hour, as if the land itself is quietly relaxing after the long stretch of daylight. The farmer carries the tools back into the barn while you wander a few steps toward the fence. Out here, even silence has texture. You hear the faint hum of wind moving through dry grass, the creak of the windmill, and the distant clucking of chickens settling near their coop. Evening routines begin once again. Inside the barn, the animals wait patiently. The cows shift their weight, while the horses turn their heads toward the open doors as you enter. Caring for livestock remained a steady part of daily life on plains farms during the 1930s. Agricultural reports compiled during the Depression frequently noted that families who maintained animals often had a slightly more stable food supply than those relying only on crops. Milk, eggs, and occasional meat could make a crucial difference during difficult seasons. You help the farmer carry feed to the stalls. Grain pours into wooden troughs and the animals gather quietly around. Their steady breathing fills the barn with a slow, peaceful rhythm. Dust drifts gently through the beams of fading sunlight that enter through the open doors. One small recollection, preserved in a South Dakota family history, tells of children who used to sweep the barn floor each evening simply to draw pictures in the dust before it settled again overnight. The next morning, the wind usually erased every design, leaving the floor smooth once more. It is a simple reminder of how constantly the dust reshaped everyday life here. When the animals have finished eating, you step back outside. The sun now hangs low above the far horizon. Long shadows stretch across the fields, turning the land into a patchwork of gold and deep brown. The woman stands near the garden collecting a few vegetables for supper. She holds a small basket filled with beans and several tomatoes that have finally ripened. Kitchen gardens like this one quietly supported many rural families during the Dust Bowl years. Extension Service records from the era show that homegrown vegetables helped supplement diets at a time when store-bought food remained expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain. You walk over and admire the harvest. Each tomato represents weeks of careful watering and patient waiting. Some agricultural historians studying rural households of the Depression era emphasize how gardens strengthened a sense of independence among farm families. Even small harvests reminded people that their efforts could still produce something good despite the surrounding hardship. The farmer soon joins you near the garden gate. For a moment, the three of you stand together watching the sunset. The sky changes colours slowly, first orange, then soft pink, and finally deeper shades of purple begin spreading across the horizon. The air grows cooler as evening settles over the plains. Back inside the farmhouse, the kitchen lamp is already glowing warmly on the table. Supper tonight is simple but satisfying. Fresh vegetables from the garden are added to a pot of stew that simmers gently on the stove. Meals like this were common across rural America during the Depression. Families relied heavily on ingredients that could be grown, preserved, or stored for long periods. You take your seat at the table while the farmer pours water into 3 metal cups. Conversation remains calm and unhurried. They speak about the repaired barn, about the neighbours' plans for planting more trees next year, and about the distant hope that rain might arrive before the end of the season. The topic of rain appears often in discussions on the plains. Meteorological records from the late 1930s eventually showed an improvement in rainfall across parts of the Dust Bowl region. When the rains did return, grasses slowly began reclaiming damaged land and helping stabilise the soil once more. Exactly how quickly the environment recovered continues to interest environmental researchers. Some evidence suggests that the land healed faster in certain areas than expected, while other regions required many years before the soil regained its former strength. The meal ends quietly. You help clear the dishes while darkness settles outside the windows. Soon the farmhouse lights dim as the evening stretches toward night. Beyond the porch, the plains lie calm, beneath a sky that is slowly filling with stars once again. Night deepens gently across the plains. After supper, the farmhouse grows quieter with each passing minute. The dishes have been washed and set to dry beside the sink, and the warm glow of the kerosene lamp casts soft shadows along the wooden walls. You step outside once more before turning in. The air feels cooler now, carrying the calm breath of evening across the wide land. Above you, the sky stretches endlessly, filled with more stars than most people ever see in crowded cities. Out here, the night belongs to the land itself. You rest your hands on the porch railing and look across the fields that fade into darkness beyond the yard. The windmill turns slowly in the breeze, its steady creak marking the quiet rhythm of the night. Days like the ones you have experienced here were repeated again and again across the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years. Farm families rose early, worked through long hours of dust and uncertainty, and ended their evenings with simple meals and quiet moments like this one. Historical farm journals written during the 1930s often describe the same steady routines. Even when crops failed and storms darkened the sky daily, life continued through small acts of persistence. You breathe in the cool air. Somewhere far away, a coyote calls into the night, its voice drifting faintly across the open prairie. A gentle calm settles over everything. One small recollection, recorded in a family diary from Oklahoma, tells of a child who once believed the stars above the plains looked brighter during drought years because there were fewer clouds to hide them. Whether the observation was scientifically correct hardly mattered. For that child, the shining sky became a quiet source of comfort during difficult times. You imagine that same sky stretching above countless farms across the region. Many families who lived through the Dust Bowl carried memories of both hardship and resilience. Scholars examining personal letters from the period often note how people balance frustration with determination, finding strength in community routine and the stubborn hope that better seasons would eventually return. Tonight, the land feels calm. The wind moves softly across the dry grass, whispering through the fields in a low and steady rhythm. The farmhouse windows glow faintly behind you, offering a small island of warmth in the vast darkness of the plains. You sit down on the porch steps. For a moment, you allow your thoughts to drift back across the day, the early morning chores, the quiet trip into town, neighbours gathering together to repair a barn roof beneath the open sky. Meals shared at the kitchen table while the wind turned the old windmill outside. Each moment forms a small thread in the larger story of life here. Dust Bowl. America was not defined only by storms and drought. It was also shaped by patience, cooperation, and the simple routines that help people endure the hardest years. You take one last look at the horizon where the fields disappear into darkness. Somewhere beyond that line, rain will eventually return. Grasses will grow again. Farms will rebuild, and the land will slowly recover from the wounds left by wind and drought. Historians studying the long arc of the Dust Bowl period often point out that the disaster ultimately changed how Americans understood the fragile balance between farming and nature. New conservation practices, soil protection programs, and careful land management grew from the lessons learned during those difficult years. But tonight, none of that feels urgent. The plains are quiet. The stars continue their slow journey across the sky, and the wind carries a gentle lullaby through the fields. You rise from the porch and step back inside the farmhouse. The lamp burns softly beside the hallway wall. Its small circle of light guides you toward the bedroom, where the window stands slightly open to the cool prairie air. You lie down beneath the blanket and listen as the windmill turns slowly outside. The steady creak becomes part of the night's peaceful rhythm. Your breathing slows. The long day fades behind you. Out across the plains, the land rests beneath its blanket of stars, waiting patiently for the promise of tomorrow. And as the quiet wind drifts over the fields and the farmhouse settles into stillness, You feel the calm weight of sleep gently closing around you. Sweet dreams.